throat has become a symbol in the viewer's mind about John Turner, and it brings back a lot of negative connotations and negative memories. So if he can stay cool, low-key anger works well on television, hot anger turns viewers off.
All right, those are the views of independent media consultant Barry McLaughlin on how the leaders react on television. Well, we're less than 3 minutes away now from Debate 88, Election 88, the big English language debate, 3 hours of debating between the leaders. And they already have been in the studio for a couple of minutes for the obligatory photo opportunity. This is what it looked like a few minutes ago inside the studio, the three men standing beside each other. Prime Minister got the middle this time. Last night it was John Turner in the middle for the photo opportunity. That was about 20 minutes or so ago, talking with the moderator, Judge Rosie Abella, from the Ontario court system, who is going to be moderating tonight. Brian Mulrooney, John Turner, and Ed Broadbent. With me now, Don Newman, our senior parliamentary editor. Our chief political correspondent, David Halton, of course, is going to be on that panel of journalists who will start grilling the three leaders in just a few moments' time. Don, give me your snapshot of what to expect on behalf of all three leaders tonight.
I think three very exciting hours of television, Peter. I think that John Turner will try to control the debate the way he did last night. He was in control of himself and control of the issues. I think Ed Broadbent will try and get into the game. He was not completely irrelevant last night, but he wasn't a main player. The debate was really between John Turner and Brian Mulroney. I think the Prime Minister will continue to try and look prime ministerial, but not if he's going to take too many shots from the other two. I think that Broadbent will try and lay a few blows on him, and I think Turner will be after him again. The Prime Minister may have to speed up his performance, soup it up anyway.
I think the thing that surprised a lot of people last night was that it really did carry 3 hours. If you were watching it, it was exciting. There were some pretty good moments of confrontation. Everybody we talked to today says, look out, there's going to be lots more of it tonight from all sides. And I think when you look at the position of Turner and Broadbent in the polls, they've got to go after him.
There's an awful lot on the line. This may be the only time that the election is on the line for all three leaders at the same time. Also, John Turner's career is really on the line, and perhaps the future of the Liberal Party on the line, too. A lot of Liberals worried that if they come third in this election, that could be a real problem for the continuation of the party as a viable political force.
Okay, a couple of reminders, because the debate starts in about 30 seconds from now. A couple of reminders. It's going for 3 hours. There will be a series of debates. First hour is on general issues, the second hour on women's issues, and the third hour back to general issues once again. As soon as the debate is over, we'll be back here inside our little booth outside Parliament Hill, and then immediately following that, the National, and there will be all sorts of reaction from across the country to the 3 hours that you're about to watch. So sit back, enjoy it. This is what the election's all about.
Live from Ottawa, Encounter 88. An exchange of views by the leaders of Canada's three major political parties on the issues of the federal election. This program is presented by the CBC, CTV, Global, Radio-Canada, Télévision 4 Saisons, and TVA television networks. The moderator for this occasion is the Honorable Rosalie Silberman Abella, distinguished jurist, legal educator, and chairperson of the Ontario Labour Relations Board.
Good evening. Tonight, the leaders of Canada's three political parties will have an opportunity to confront one another, exchange views, and share their vision with you. In format and length, this evening has been designed with the hope that it will assist Canadians in making informed judgments about the widest possible range of national issues. The order of speaking throughout has been drawn by lot. To begin, each leader will deliver an opening statement of 3 minutes. The first speaker will be the leader of the New Democratic Party, Ed Broadbent. The second will be the leader of the Progressive Conservative Party, Brian Mulroney. And the third, the leader of the Liberal Party, John Turner. At the conclusion of these opening remarks, there will be 3 one-hour rounds, the second of which, by agreement, will concentrate on issues of particular concern to women. Each round will consist of 3 debates between 2 of the leaders, and each leader is entitled to leave the podium when he is not participating in the debate. In these debate periods, the leaders will be responding to questions from the panel, who have worked together to develop the questions and themes to be raised. The 3 journalists representing the television networks are David Halton, Chief Political Correspondent for CBC Television News in Ottawa, Pamela Wallen, CTV's National Affairs Correspondent, and Doug Small, Ottawa Bureau Chief for Global News. At the end of the third round, each leader will have 3 minutes for closing remarks. The formal rules have been kept to a minimum, but to the extent that these rules have been agreed upon, it is the moderator's role to ensure that the principle of equal time is recognized, that the time limits are respected, and that the proper order is followed. To do this, the participants have agreed that the moderator can intervene where appropriate to enforce the rules as fairly as possible. I know there are a lot of caveats in that explanation, but I think you can't expect anything else from a moderator who's a lawyer. We begin with the opening remarks of the leader of the New Democratic Party, Mr. Broadbent.
Good evening. This election is about the future of our country. It's about maintaining our independence and using that independence for fairness for ordinary Canadians. Last night in the French debate, Mr. Mulroney failed completely to answer criticisms that his trade deal threatens our families, our environment, our Medicare, and pensions, that it jeopardizes regional development and sets back programs for our farmers. The truth is that Mr. Mulroney signed a trade deal that goes way beyond the exchange of commodities between Canada and the United States. It affects virtually every aspect of Canadian life. And the truth is also that time after time, Mr. Mulroney gave the Americans what they wanted, but failed to get what Canadians wanted. Mr. Mulroney's deal permits subsidies in our energy sector, because that's what the Americans wanted. It does not permit it to use subsidies to stop polluters, to encourage, to foster development in the arts, and that's what Canadians wanted. Mr. Mulroney's deal will permit the United States to have a say in what's to be included in our regional development policies, instead of making it clear that decisions in such a crucial area affecting Canadians should be made only by Canadians. Mr. Mulroney's deal threatens our Medicare and pension plans, as businessmen are already saying benefits in Canada must be reduced to meet U.S. standards, a country where you find 36 million without any form of health insurance whatsoever. This deal must be stopped because it takes away our right to make our own decisions about our own country in our own way. I want a fair Canada. I want a tax system that helps the average family instead of giving special breaks to the rich. A government that protects our lakes and forests and stands up to corporate polluters. I want a Canada that cherishes our parents and grandparents instead of cutting back on their pension benefits. I want a Canada that believes in equality instead of ignoring women and remaining indifferent to the legitimate claims of Aboriginal people. I want a government that puts an end to patronage and has open competition for contracts. I want a government that makes reasonable promises and then keeps them. Just for a change, we need a government that says the concerns of families of loggers and nurses, farmers, fishermen, are just as important as the concerns of bankers. Now is the time for such a change, one made with confidence and determination. Now is the time, at long last, to put the priorities where they ought to belong, on the needs, hopes, aspirations, and dreams of the average family. This time, we can do it.
Thank you, Mr. Broadbent. We turn now to the leader of the Progressive Conservative Party, Brian Mulroney.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. 4 years ago, you honored me and my party with a mandate to govern our country. Tonight, I believe that I can say that we have done what we set out to do. We have set this country, our beloved Canada, on a new course. We have a stronger Canada today, better able to make our own future in a world of change and uncertainty. Canadians have created nearly 1,000 new jobs a day, every day, since this government has been in office, the fastest employment growth in the Western world. Because of this prosperity, we are better able to finance social programs for those who need our care. Canada has, in the last 4 years, led all of the countries in the industrialized world in economic growth. And that is your achievement. The government's role was to make the changes in policy that allowed Canadians to create this new prosperity. And we are a more united country than we were, and that was long overdue. Governments are now at all levels working better together in the national interest, which is your interest. And I think we have strengthened our role internationally. And so what has been achieved is there for you to judge, as are the choices for the future. What group of men and women should you choose to maintain Canada's strength and the growth and the prosperity and our standard of living in a complex and changing world? For us, the Free Trade Agreement is central to that future. It illustrates very plainly the difference between the government and the two opposition parties. We want to move ahead and strengthen our values and turn the future to Canada's advantage. I know that Canada can compete, and I know that Canadians can excel in the markets of the world and strengthen our identity as Canadians in the process. In today's world, Canada's economy can compete and grow, or it can retreat and shrink. We have chosen the path of growth. My opponents tonight have a duty not only to criticize, but to explain to you their alternative. They would tear up the Free Trade Agreement. And then what? They offer you nothing but the poverty of protectionism. That is the real threat to our social programs and our environment. And just because you sell someone your products, as we all know, doesn't mean that you have to buy his values. Free trade is supported by premiers of 8 provinces, by small and large business, by agricultural producers, by consumers, and by just about every major public policy institute in Canada. I ask you very directly, do they all love Canada less because they want to trade more? No, they support this agreement because they have confidence in Canada and see free trade as essential for our future. And so I ask all of you tonight who share that confidence with us in Canada to join with us and support us in this election. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mulroney. Finally, we will hear from the leader of the Liberal Party, John Turner.
Good evening. This election is about our future as an independent country. What Canadians will decide on November 21st is the kind of Canada we want for ourselves, for our children. Mr. Mulroney and Mr. Broadbent will talk to you about leadership. They mean leadership of a party. What they should be talking about is leadership of a country. Canada is more important than any single one person. This election is not a popularity contest. The issue is the future of Canada. My agenda for our country is clear. We have a better trading alternative than the Mulroney trade deal. We also have a progressive platform, a blueprint for Canada. Against this, Mr. Mulroney has a hidden agenda. He now wants to turn us into a pale replica of the United States. Mr. Broadbent seems to be spending most of his time during this election hiding his program, trying to make us forget what his real agenda is, as it is found in his party's resolutions. We Liberals will put fairness back into the tax system. In 1984, the Conservatives said they wouldn't raise taxes 1 single cent. Then Mr. Mulroney gave us the biggest tax increases since Confederation. Now he has plans to bring in a $10 billion hidden sales tax on everything. It costs the average taxpayer $1,000 more a year. Our child care plan will give you the freedom to make the right choices for you and your family. It will be affordable and accessible. We believe that every Canadian has the right to affordable shelter. That is why we will provide a tax credit up to $2,500 a year if you pay more than 30% of your income for shelter, whether you own a home or rent an apartment. We will make it a crime to pollute. The protection of our environment will be a priority. We will get an agreement with the Americans to clean up the air we breathe and the water we share. My personal commitment to you is that I will give you an honest and ethical government. My cabinet ministers will spend their time in the cabinet room defending Canadians, not in the courtroom defending themselves. Above all, we will never, never sign a deal which surrenders our control and ability to manage our economy, or our social and regional equality programs, or our destiny as a people. Mr. Mulroney's trade deal does just that. I believe that tonight's debate will convince you that we in the Liberal Party have the policies, the commitment, and the ability to get on with the job of building a stronger, fairer, and more sovereign Canada. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Turner. Now that we've heard the opening remarks from the party leaders, we begin the first one-on-one encounter between Mr. Mulroney and Mr. Turner. David Halton, you have the first question.
Thank you, Isabella. Good evening, gentlemen. I'd like to start, Mr. Mulroney, by taking you back to those electrifying moments in the '84 debate when you demanded an apology from Mr. Turner for making what you called those horrible patronage appointments. You promised to clean up the sleazy patronage habits of the Liberals, but once in office, you proceeded very quickly to start naming hundreds and hundreds of Tories to plum positions across this country. Sure, you also appointed some very high-profile Canadians from other parties. We know the list. But surely you've misled Canadians in promising them a new political morality in Canada and practicing very much the old one.
Well, Mr. Halton, you're right. It was an electrifying moment, and I think one whose impact in terms of patronage and conflict of interest, which is a new reality for Canadians, all of us, access to information in 1984, 1985, has impacted upon all governments. The Peterson government in Ontario lost a number of ministers through conflict of interest, even the Bourassa government in Quebec, the government of British Columbia. These realities that intruded upon our lives, and I acknowledge, as I have in the past, that I, as Prime Minister, did not in 1984 do as well as I should have in terms of moving more swiftly to depoliticize the appointments of what are called governor and council appointments. It is true that one of the first things that we did was appoint the McGraw Commission on Parliamentary Reform, and that the right of the Parliamentary Committee to vet all GIC appointments and to give a view as to whether these people were competent. I should tell you that of some 1,700 GIC appointments that are made from all walks of life, only 72, I believe, were called, only 72 nominees were called before this Parliamentary Committee for examination and review. And I believe all of them were either approved or approved without much difficulty. We then moved immediately to double the number of women who were appointed to agencies, boards, and commissions. We doubled the number of multicultural representatives to agencies, boards, and commissions. We increased by 70% the number of women in federal judicial positions. I appointed the second woman to the Supreme Court of Canada. Persons without the slightest relationship to my own political party. And so I believe that after a bit of a slow start, I'll acknowledge, we made some major improvements that most people acknowledge. The appointments of, I believe it's fair to say that I appointed more members of the NDP, more members of the Liberals, more members of the Parti Québécois and the Parti Créditiste and the Parti Libéral Provincial than any other Prime Minister in history, in my mandate. And I'm proud of that. I think that the appointments of Donald MacDonald and Yves Fortier and Ian Deans and Stephen Lewis and Sylvia Gold to decision-making positions in the public service, this has never happened before on this scale. And I think it's a good representative of what Canada should be. Have we done it perfectly? No. Have we made, and I acknowledge that, Mr. Halton, have we picked up our socks and improved a great deal? I think any fair-minded person would acknowledge that we have. We've put in place some very fundamental reforms, but most of all, I think the tremendous quality of the people such as those I've mentioned. These are not token Liberals, by the way, or token NDPers. A very large number of talented people from all walks of life who have been appointed. I conclude simply by giving you an indication of the most recent set of appointments, which involve a very important area of our national life, the Immigration and Appeal and Refugee Determination Board, where some 50% of the appointments were members of visible minority communities without the slightest association with my political party. Many of them in key positions were women, leaders of the multicultural communities. The co-chairman is a refugee himself. And in all cases, I think most people would agree that there has not been the slightest degree of partisanship. So I think, Mr. Halton, that while I acknowledge some of the criticism readily in regard to the early part of the mandate, I think any fair-minded person, I hope, would agree that we've made some very vast improvements, I think, for the betterment of public life.
Thank you, Mr. Mulrooney.
Well,
Mr.
of course,
Turner?
Mr. Mulrooney, there's nothing like an approaching election to make someone come to his senses. I think for the first 3 years, particularly of your mandate, there were more appointments of friends and chums and the boys than in any period in our history. And as Canadians, we've had to undergo a government full of scandals, resignations of ministers, conflict of interest charges, police inquiries. It's been a very sad reflection on the whole political process. And I would say that your commitment to bring in a conflict of interest bill that you said you would do in response to the Parker Commission on Sinclair Stevens was a very tardy effort. As you know, the bill wasn't brought forward in time or pressed in time to get through Parliament. And so I would say that the next government of Canada has really got to come to grips with conflict of interest legislation to ensure that the public interest comes first, that it comes before the private interest or any seeking after private gain, that in a government that ministers' assets become public, that the lobby legislation be strengthened so that we know who is representing who in Ottawa on the part of business or unions or other professional interests, that we have a new look at the financing of our political parties. And I'd say that it's been a very sad 4 years for Canadians to have to live through what you led us through.
Well, I'm sorry that the Leader of the Opposition feels that way, and he certainly has a very selective memory if he's simply attacking us in regard to some of the difficulties that we have had. He was a member of a government in the 70s which just about set new records in terms of these kinds of problems. But a political party in a new situation is, I suppose, very much like a family. You run into difficulties. It is true we had some difficulties, and I had some tough moments, and I've still got the scars to prove it. But I suppose the question is, how did I respond to those challenges? I responded by passing lobbyist legislation, the registration of lobbyists, by introducing the toughest conflict of interest legislation that I think exists in Canada, by doing a lot of things to clean up an institutionalized act, Mr. Turner, that you were familiar with and in which you were involved in the past. And I think that we have made a substantial break in a new era that I think will benefit all political parties and the participation of all politicians. If I may just conclude, if I may, just on this, in terms of public financing. We, the candidates of my party in Quebec, I believe that the answer eventually is public financing of all political parties. And we are making a move now in the province of Quebec where all of the candidates are being financed not by corporations or by unions at all, but by contributions of private donors. And I think that while it's not a perfect example, it's a good illustration of leadership that could perhaps serve us in the ways that we could draft new legislation for our future guidance and governance.
I think why Mr. Halton asked the question was that you made a great issue of it in the last election campaign, in the confrontation we had.
No, you raised it in
You
that
promised
campaign.
to clean it up.
I didn't raise it.
You promised to clean it up, and you didn't clean it up. You made it an issue throughout the whole election campaign, and then for the first 3 years afterwards, until you saw another election on the horizon, you campaigned and ran a government as if nothing had changed, and if this was the opportunity, once in power, to take advantage.
Well, that is completely wrong, because the first thing that we did after we came in, and I thought that you acknowledged this in the House of Commons, was to move to the correction of one of our fundamental wrongs, which was on parliamentary reform. And the commission headed by the Honourable James McGrath, and the vice chairman of which was the Honourable Andre Ouellette, did some very important work in regard to this.
I think that was an excellent report, but your House leader didn't implement much of it.
Well, I believe that most people who follow Parliament would acknowledge that the McGraw Commission, in terms of parliamentary renewal and reform, was perhaps the most important instrument to affect Parliament in many decades. And I think that's been widely acknowledged, and the work of James McGraw has been widely saluted. And I think immediately that was one of the first things that we did. We moved, Mr. Turner, in 1985 in regard to lobbyists, the registration of lobbyists. You know, the lobbyists in Ottawa, even you wouldn't say that the lobbyists are all a bunch of Tories. You know, most of them are of liberal background. But be that as it may, we have proceeded and we have passed a very tough and new law that I think you support. We have moved with regard to conflict of interest with the toughest law that exists in Canada. Now,
you did not pass that law. That law died on the order paper. It stayed so long and was not being pressed by your government, Mr. Mulroney.
No, that, Mr. Turner, is not the case. It did not die because it was not being pressed by our government. We made it a priority. After the Commission report, we waited for the Commission report. We incorporated into that law the recommendations of the Parker Commission, the definition of conflict of interest, and we moved it as expeditiously as we could.
You had the full cooperation of Mr. Broadbent and myself, and nothing moved. And I'm saying, like a lot of other issues, whether it's the environment or housing or battered women, the issues that are before Canadians, your repentance has been a very last-minute one.
Well, I beg your pardon, because our action in regards to the promotion of women is something to be proud of, and you should not involve battered women with a question of patronage.
Sorry to interrupt, Mr. Mulroney. It would be a lot easier if we could hear one of you at a time. Mr. Turner, is there anything you wanted to conclude with?
Well, I think...
I thought he had.
I think we've probably exhausted the subject and then exhausted Mr. Mulroney, because it is like a lot of his exemplary conduct, a last-minute repentance.
Thank you.
I'm ready to, if the leader of the opposition says he has exhausted the subject because of me, I'm ready to debate it and to discuss it very adequately here or any other place.
Mr. Mulroney, I'm sure that opportunity will arise again. Pamela Wallen, you have the next question.
Why don't we give you that opportunity right now, Mr. Mulroney? We have heard your apologies tonight and your explanations.
Ms. Wallen, the next question is to Mr. Turner.
I am getting there. We have heard some comments from you, Mr. Mulroney, but within the last few weeks on the campaign trail, you've also been promising judgeships and senators' jobs and some cash for votes. As for you, Mr. Turner, you seem to have no qualms about using your old patronage appointments in the Senate to have your way on free trade, overriding what went on in the House of Commons. I think the voters in this country know that there is really an option for clean government in Canada. I'm wondering why they should believe that either one of you would be prepared to deliver it, Mr. Turner.
Let me deal with that Senate issue. I asked the senators not to defeat the trade bill, but to withhold assent from it until the Canadian people have decided. Otherwise, in this election, we would never have had the opportunity to come to grips with the most central issue of our time, whether or not we retain our sovereignty as a nation, our self-respect as a nation, and the economic levers that are fundamental to the nation. That is all the Senate did. The mandate of Mr. Mulroney had run 4 years. He never told the country that he was going to negotiate such a deal. In other words, his own personal views, when he sought the leadership of his party, were against a free trade arrangement. He said it would affect our sovereignty and he would have nothing of it. There were 1,000 days of secret negotiations between the governments of Canada and the United States, and yet he limited debate in the House of Commons to 12 days. There were virtually no public hearings. None at all, except in the doldrums of summer and August when people had to come to Ottawa. There were no hearings across the country. In those circumstances, no mandate, no prior notice of this Prime Minister on a deal changing the direction of Canada fundamentally, no public inquiry or hearing, and virtually no debate in the House of Commons. Then I took the most democratic alternative possible. I said, let the people decide. And now we have an opportunity, and I hope we'll have a chance to talk about that issue here tonight.
Mr. Mulroney?
Yes, may I just say, Ms. Wallen, there's been no promise of judgeships or senatorships in an election campaign. I hope you haven't lost your sense of humor in terms of any entertainment that may go on in any political rally. With regard to the appointments that you raise, the question that you raise, I should point out to you that when I became Prime Minister, I found that there were 7 women serving as deputy ministers, only 7. There are now, I believe, 17. There were only 2 women serving as ambassadors or heads of mission in Canada. After all of these years, only 2. There are now 14. There were the number of judges in the federal public service increased by some 70%. So that is I think, the comment of the kinds of initiatives that we have taken in terms of proper appointments that never get mentioned. The kinds of appointments, you know, if you appoint the brother-in-law of the first cousin of a conservative organizer to the Unemployment Insurance Commission in Timmins, it gets an 8-column headline in the Globe and Mail. But if you appoint Gérald Laforêt, to the first Acadian in history, to the Supreme Court of Canada without the slightest association with my party, or you appoint Madame Dubé, Lheureux from Quebec City without the slightest association of my party to the Supreme Court of Canada, Stanley Hart as Deputy Minister of Finance, no association with my party, Norman Spector, bringing in all of these talented people, many of whom I suppose were of liberal persuasion. I think this is good for Canada. And I think we have done a fair amount of that, and I hope it will be recognized.
There's nothing like putting a few ornaments, you know, out in the store windows so that you continue to play the game back in the back room of the store. And that is exactly what Mr. Mulroney has done.
If that is the case, I asked the Leader of the Opposition why, if these were so bad, why he didn't once show up at a committee hearing to oppose one of these appointments. Give me the name of one person that we have appointed whom you would have opposed.
I'm not going to get personal in that way.
You didn't show up once at a committee hearing.
On national television, you know, criticize somebody's reputation now that he or she is appointed. You know that that's not the way to handle it. This ratifying process that you set up in Parliament is still a sham. You haven't brought the major appointments before Parliament to say the way you said you would. But to invite me to pick here and there on your appointments
Mr. Turner,
at the risk of personal reputations at stake, I won't do that.
I'm sorry. With a broad brush, sir, you have just tarnished all kinds of reputations, and yet you never once went before the Parliamentary Committee yourself to object to the quality or the competence of any one of those persons, and you are not able to identify. It would be fair to them if you identified one of them. You persist in using the broad brush of denigration. I think that's unfair to all kinds of people.
I'm not going to use the vehicle of national television to comment on any particular person's reputation after he or she's been appointed. That wouldn't be fair. You know it.
Well, you did it last night.
We will move now to the next question from Doug Small, please.
Free trade, Prime Minister. As Mr. Turner has already reminded you here tonight, in 1983, you opposed free trade as a threat to this country's sovereignty. Now you support it. You say only mules, donkeys, and imbeciles don't change their minds. What I'd like to know is what it would take to change your mind again. Under what circumstances would you invoke the 6-month escape clause that you remind people you built into this agreement and scrub it?
Well, I've explained the circumstances under which we got into this agreement and the negotiations for it. After 1984, with the rise in protectionism in the United States, which was affecting so many Canadian jobs, and there were so many actions against Canadian employers and Canadian employees, the MacDonald Royal Commission was subsequently appointed. It made a recommendation in support of...
Mr. Mulroney, I'm very sorry to interrupt. The round is now over and we must move on to the next encounter. For the next encounter, Mr. Turner will engage Mr. Broadbent. Mr. Halton, you have the question.
Gentlemen, you both, of course, rejected the free trade deal, but also come out in favor of limited sector-by-sector agreements with freer trade with the U.S. You're in favor of more secure access to the American market. You're in favor of dispute settlement mechanisms. Why do you reject this deal holus bolus rather than trying to renegotiate it and at least preserving the good parts in it which you recognize?
May I? Well, that's precisely the point. If the deal had been restricted to a dispute settlement mechanism, if we had phased in the tariff reduction agreements that were already in place, leading over the next decade to virtual elimination of most tariffs between the two countries, if we had simply a series of bilateral agreements comparable to the Auto Pact, even though they're difficult to achieve, that would have been fine. But what we have here is not that at all. As I said in my opening comments, what we have here, Mr. Halton, is a deal that touches virtually every aspect of Canadian life. It has implications on regional development policy. The whole question of what constitutes a subsidy is now being negotiated. The Americans know Their view diametrically opposes ours. They regard most of our regional development programs as constituting a subsidy. I reject that. I don't think that should be any part of this deal. We know now that because of this arrangement, Canadian business, the president, for example, of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, I have an interesting quote here, has said, contrary to what Mr. Mulroney wants us to believe, that the fact, here he's talking about all Canadian business, the following: we in Canada are obviously forced to create the same conditions in Canada that exist in the U.S., whether it is the unemployment insurance scheme, workmen's compensation, the cost of government, the level of taxation, or whatever. End of quote. Now, I could give you a half a dozen leading businessmen and women who have said this deal affects our social programs, it affects regional development policy, it affects unemployment insurance. It does all of these things to radically change Canadian life. We didn't build up this country, our forefathers, for decades before us, with better social programs, better regional development, control over our own energy, to allow Mr. Mulroney and this government to sell it all out. That's what's wrong with the deal. You can't tinker with this deal. You've got to scrap it. You've got to get rid of it, and then go back to building sensible trade relations, strictly on trade, with the United States and with other countries in the world, and that's what we would do.
Mr. Turner.
I start from the proposition that 80% of our relationship with the United States is now free trade as a result of international negotiations since the war, incidentally under liberal administrations. All Mr. Mulroney was talking about was the remaining 20%. Our quarrel is not with lowering tariffs. Our quarrel was with the fact that he sold out the country for that other 20%. Why did he go bilateral, head-to-head with the United States in a negotiation? He was going to say that he was worried about protectionist sentiment in the United States. I said to him, that would mean that you would have to get secure access to the American market by getting a specific exemption in any deal from American protectionist trade law. We didn't get that exemption. And the Binational Tribunal cannot enforce that exemption. It enforces American trade law under American precedent and American jurisprudence. That's what the deal says. That being so, we are in a worse position than we were before, because we are bound by American protectionist law, and we can no longer challenge that law under the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade internationally. We're worse off. So the deal is not negotiable, because it's quite clear that the Congress of the United States would never yield its jurisdiction over its protectionist trade law. What do? Well, I hope Canadians defeat this deal by defeating Mr. Mulroney. Then I would go down to Washington and say, look, we were up front with you. You've just had a general election, a federal election. We've had one. The Canadian people have turned down the deal. Now, where do we go from here? We go back to the technique that has worked very successfully between Americans and Canadians since the war. We would proceed internationally and move again to enlarge the jurisdiction of the GATT into services, agriculture, enlarge the dispute mechanism system. We would also, and this is important, no trade deal with the United States, or Japan, Europe, is any substitute for a national economic strategy. No one is going to make us more competitive as Canadians. No trade deal. We have to accelerate our research and development. We have to have a national apprenticeship plan for younger people who are leaving school. We need more attention on post-secondary education. We need to focus our attention on the Pacific Rim, which we've neglected. After all, we happen to be a Pacific nation as well as an Atlantic nation. We've got to restore our contacts with Europe. And on a sector-by-sector basis, if the new GATT rules allow it, yes, we can explore where we could go on steel or other major commodities. But this deal went well beyond trade. It just does not deal with tariff barriers and non-tariff barriers. It goes to the soul of the country. It gives Americans national treatment in Canada. It sets up a subsidy negotiation that will wipe out our social programs, our regional equality programs, and go right to the sovereignty of the country. That's why I'm against the deal, and that's why it's the cause of my life to try to defeat it.
Thank you, Mr. President.
If I may come back on this, Mr. Turner, I find your opposition to the deal, to put it directly, very inconsistent. Here in the middle of an election, you say you're deeply opposed to it, and it's the real cause of your life. But the reality is we've had 3 crucial votes in the House of Commons. You missed 2 of them, and on one of them, half of your caucus didn't even turn up. The New Democratic Party was there fighting in the House of Commons when it counted to try to stop the deal. You weren't there as leader on 2, I repeat, of the 3 crucial votes, nor was half your caucus. Now, it's one thing to make a big deal of this in an election campaign when your party is in 3rd place and you say, well, we'll start waving the flag and we'll pretend we're saving our country and maybe that'll get us back elected. I want to know, when it counted in the House of Commons, why you weren't there.
I led this debate, Mr. Broadbent, ever since the deal was signed on October 5th of last year.
Oh?
And I've carried it in the House of Commons, spoke on every major occasion. And my commitment is full and plenty. I want to ask you why it is, first, you never mentioned the trade deal in your first initial statement when this election was called. Obviously, it didn't have pride of place. And why it is that you were willing, at one time, until I guess you thought better of it, to contemplate a coalition with the Conservative Party if there were a minority government. A coalition with a party that wants this trade deal through. I don't know how you can square that one.
Well, let's really have a go on this one. Right from the word go, I said we would, from the very day they announced it, totally opposed to this deal. You and your caucus were still trying to make up your mind. Then you finally, after allegedly an interesting caucus discussion, said, well, you tried to one-up the NDP so you'd come out and tear it up. Then just a few weeks ago, I saw an interview in Le Devoir, a leading Quebecois newspaper, in which Mr. Garneau, your finance critic, says, no, Mr. Turner wouldn't tear up the deal. We have consistently, persistently opposed this deal, and everyone knows it, but we did it in the House of Commons, if I may say so. Our members were there, day in and day out, fighting it in committee, and when we looked around for Liberal assistance to fight it in the House, more often than not, including yourself, you weren't there.
That is absolute nonsense.
Well, were you there? Were you there for the vote?
Gentlemen,
were you there for the vote?
Excuse me, gentlemen, it's not fair to either position. Gentlemen, I'm going to ask you, please, we can't hear either one of you when you're both speaking. One at a time, please. Mr. Turner.
I want to say to Mr. Broadbent that our position has been consistent from day one. Yes, I said I would tear it up, but I found a better way in our relationship with the Americans. I asked the Senate to hold back the deal so that the people could decide first, and then if it were defeated, there'd be no deal to tear up. A far straighter way to deal with our American friends rather than having to annul the contract afterwards by using the 6-month clause like you wanted to do. And
so you're not going to tear it up?
And for a few days, you didn't know where you stood.
On what?
On whether I had taken the right move. For the first 3 or 4 days, you were against the Senate, and then you thought...
I've always been against the Senate. Nor would I put people in the Senate. Nor would I appoint undemocratic senators like you did. You criticized Mr. Mulroney and patronage, and you, sir, put the people in the Senate. I would never do that because it's an undemocratic body.
You know as well as I do that I believe and have believed for some time, and our party's on record for an elected Senate.
Well, why did you appoint people to the Senate?
You want to abolish the Senate.
Why did you appoint them?
I'd like to know what you're going to say to the people of Western Canada who want a better territorial balance so that through an elected Senate, they can have some equilibrium between the overwhelming population of Ontario and Quebec.
You shifted away. You put the senators in.
Mr. Broadbent, I'm going to ask you if you wouldn't mind waiting until Mr. Turner's completed his comments so that we can hear both of you.
And, you know, in terms of caucus, I remember Steve Langdon, and I've got great regard for your members, some of them, but Steve, you know, wanted to approve the continuation of negotiations, then he had to pull back. You know, that wasn't very consistent. So I don't think there's any purpose in trying to get procedural about this. I'm not questioning your good faith or your motives. And I think you ought to understand that as a Canadian, I am devoting the best energy of my life to trying to convince our fellow citizens that this deal is a sellout, that it would change the kind of Canada we are, it would change the way we look at ourselves, our way of life, our choices, our ability to control our future. And I hope that you will support that effort in every way possible.
Mr. Broadbent.
Well, you don't have to worry about us. I just want to know if when the votes come, you're going to be there. And I pointed out when the votes came, you weren't there. That's all.
Pamela Waller?
We've heard and seen the disagreement, and I guess the Senate issue aside, other than that, you two gentlemen come down on the same side of two of the very key issues in very general terms in this election. Free trade, you both oppose it. Meech Lake, you both supported it. When you are on the same team, it's been very difficult for the voters to decide why they should pick either one of you. If you're opposed to free trade, they have two options. If they're in favor of free trade, they just have one. Could you make a rather simple, short, direct case as to why each one of you is the best on that score?
Well, I'll respond first this time.
Yes, Mr. Turner. It's Mr. Turner's turn, Mr. Broadbent.
I think Canadians will look at the two parties. They'll find the New Democratic Party beholden to organized labor with all those protectionist instincts still there. The New Democratic Party, despite the bonhomie of Mr. Broadbent and his intentions to try to disguise where the party stands and to bury some of the program, to try to be all things to all people. Despite that, Canadians know that the Liberal Party is independent of any economic group. We're not beholden to big business. We're not beholden to big labor. We're not beholden to any particular interest group in the country. That's one issue. Second issue, we're not only outward looking in trade, and always have been international. Witness what we did to lower those trade barriers over the years when we had the responsibility of government. We are also outward looking in our defense alliances. And we are committed to NATO, we're committed to our European and American friends in the defense alliance, and we're committed to our North American defense pact. The New Democratic Party has on its books a resolution that is binding on the party, binding on Mr. Broadbent as leader, calling upon the party, if it ever forms a government, to pull Canada out of our defense alliances. Mr. Broadbent can skate around, try to disguise it, say he wouldn't do it in the first term, wouldn't do it in the second term. But that's not good enough, because I don't believe Canadians want the type of isolationist, protectionist, neutralist politics and policy that the NDP stands for. Mr. Broadbent can express his own personal views, but he's bound by a party program that he's desperately trying to hide. And that goes to the items that are still on the agenda for the NDP: nationalizing a Canadian bank, nationalizing 50% of the Canadian resource industry. That's there. Now, he can sound as mellow as he wants about it, but that's the reason I believe Canadians will pick a liberal alternative as a progressive and direct alternative to this trade deal.
Mr. Broadbent?
Well, I'd be very happy to reply to that list. Let me first of all say that Mr. Turner has indicated that the Liberal Party is not beholden to any one group, and he implies that we're beholden in some sense to the labor movement because we get money from them. I've said many times, I publicly say it with pride, yes, we get about 25% of our money democratically decided by members in the trade union movement. You, Mr. Turner, get over 50% of your money, your party, from banks, from big corporations that have no democratic vote whatsoever. They don't consult their customers. They don't consult their shareholders. You take the money from big corporations. Yes, more than 50%. We get about 25% only from democratically decided trade unions. I give my option any day over yours. But let's take the basic question of why should people vote for us that was asked, as opposed to Mr. Turner as an alternative to Mr. Mulroney's government on the trade deal. Well, we're consistent. Unlike Mr. Turner, we don't favor the cruise testing missile testing one day and oppose it the next. We don't say, yes, we have to deal with polluters one day and then oppose it the next, both of which contradict the positions Mr. Turner's government's done, in opposition he's done. But basically, I would like to say this. Mr. Turner has been there as Prime Minister. He had power. He has recently said that he would help municipalities if he formed a government again with sewer treatment to deal with pollution. Well, just a year ago, or 4 years ago, excuse me, when Mr. Turner was Prime Minister, you had the same option open to you, sir, and you said no. The municipalities asked you then, when you were Prime Minister, to do the same thing. At the time, you said no. You are now talking about aid to education. When you were Minister of Finance, it was a Liberal government, when you were the Minister himself, who cut back, put a ceiling on money going to post-secondary education, and for health, by the way, to the province. Let me finish, and then you can come in. You talk now about the environment. You were part of a government that did virtually nothing about it. You criticized the Prime Minister on patronage. But you, sir, were Prime Minister, made a whole list of patronage appointees, every bit as bad as any precedent in the past. You brought in tax loopholes for the rich. You don't now favor a minimum corporate tax. 60,000 profitable corporations in this country pay no tax whatsoever. Even Ronald Reagan, when he discovered his secretary paid more taxes than large corporations, so he brought in a minimum corporate tax.
Mr. Broadbent,
you, Mr. Turner, haven't done it.
The round is just about over, and I'd like Mr. Turner to have an opportunity to rebut.
This is a bit of a scattergun approach of Mr. Broadbent, but let me say on corporate taxes, What he has proposed during this election and what's in his program is an increase of corporate taxes generally for pollution. I said, let's make the polluter pay directly and have the general funds of the country clean up retroactively that mess. But in the raising of taxes that he contemplates, and then the elimination of the capital gains exemption that he contemplates for small, independent Canadian-owned business, what he is really doing is stifling entrepreneurship in this country. He's taking from one pocket into another. He's preaching that old-time ideology of hitting the rich without ever defining who the rich are. And when we go through some of the figures of the New Democratic Party, we find we're really talking about people $30,000 to $40,000 a year.
Thank you, Mr. Turner. Mr. Broadbent, the next debate will be between Mr. Broadbent and Mr. Mulroney. And Doug Small, you have the first question.
Well, Mr. Mulroney, I'm still curious to know what conditions you would think would be necessary to scrub your trade deal, but perhaps when you're answering that, you might add to that an answer on the question of exemptions. When you were negotiating this deal, when the deal was being negotiated, you said that Canada required as an obligation an exemption from U.S. trade laws that have hurt our exports and everything from lumber to fish. It was an essential element of this deal for you. Why were you able to accept a deal in the end that didn't have this guarantee?
Well, in regard to that, Mr. Small, first of all, I should tell you it's sort of strange for me as leader of the Conservative Party and leader of the government to come upon the NDP and the Liberals in a lover's quarrel. This is the first time I've seen this in about 4 years after watching them cooperate so actively in the House of Commons. With regard to the question, it is our intention under the agreement to secure access through the elimination of tariff barriers, through the elimination of non-tariff barriers, through the elimination of the sideswipe, through the elimination of the new requirement that prevents the American government from initiating protectionist measures against Canada, by the existence of the new binational dispute settlement mechanism, which is a first for Canada and for the United States. We persisted, Mr. Small, and I asked Simon Reisman, who was the most outstanding negotiator in Canada, who negotiated the Auto Pact, when, by the way, a lot of people said the Auto Pact would be a disaster. These same people today are recognizing that the Auto Pact was a bonanza. And Simon Reisman is the very same remarkable man who negotiated both. And we looked at it in the light of the climate that we discussed a little earlier, in the light of the need for more jobs, for more investment, for greater productivity, for lower prices for consumers. This is the kind of transaction that can reduce costs to the average Canadian family by approximately $800 a year, greater security of access. So in the light of the rising protectionism and the will to perfect, if we could, an instrument that would liberalize our trade, create 250,000 new jobs in Canada over the life of the phase-in process of the agreement, we thought that this was very much in Canada's national interest. May I just say that I was sort of taken aback by Mr. Turner's comments that the free trade deal was somehow done in secret. Nothing has been more debated. The Macdonald Royal Commission held hearings across the nation for 3 years. There are 72 volumes of research. I met with the premiers for an unprecedented 11 times. One meeting, I think, lasted for some 15 hours. It's been debated in the House until it was coming out our ears. Nothing has been more debated in the history of Canada, I don't believe, than in the last number of years, than this free trade agreement. I did it with pride because I thought it was good for Canada. I had given Ambassador Reisman specific instructions. No impingement upon our capacity for regional development, no effects on our Medicare programs. And I'm sorry?
Those American laws, though, still apply. You said...
Mr. Small, we've agreed the rules are that there will be no supplementaries. Mr. Mulroney, I do want to give you an opportunity to debate, and Mr. Broadbent, if you wish to respond.
Yes, I do indeed. I want to know why Mr. Mulroney signed such a deal. We didn't get any answers last night. Maybe he will pick up from where we left off last night when I talked about social programs, regional development programs, unemployment insurance, pensions, all being affected. I suggested that Mr. Zimmerman, Mr. Mulroney probably talks to him regularly on the phone, Miranda had indicated the same thing. The president of the Ford Motor Company had said that. And sir, I have a quote now from another old buddy of yours, I suspect, Mr. Thibault, the president of the Canadian Manufacturers Association, who said this, and don't take it from me, he's saying this: we in Canada are obviously forced to create the same conditions in Canada that exist in the United States, whether it's unemployment insurance scheme, workman's compensation, the cost of government, the level of taxation, or whatever. He is saying there's, because of your deal, total pressure on all of these programs in Canada to bring them down to the same level of the U.S., which I remind you, includes a country where 36 million Americans have no health insurance whatsoever. Now, do you agree with him that there's this pressure to harmonize? And if you do agree, why didn't you get specific exemptions in the deal for all these social programs?
Well, Mr. Broadbent, I haven't seen Mr. Thibault's comments, and I know that you wouldn't hold me responsible for individual comments of individual Canadians. I know nothing about that. I'd be happy.
Well, I'm just asking if you agree with the argument.
Well, with what is said there, I don't agree with it. And I'd have to examine the context in which he said it. I gave specific instructions as Prime Minister to Ambassador Simon Reisman that health and social programs, that our capacity for regional development would not be impaired in any way. And they have not been touched.
But why didn't you get an exemption for subsidies specifically? You got them for energy. There's an exemption. You can put subsidies in energy because the Americans are going to get our energy at our prices. We can't charge them more than we charge Canadians. They got an exemption for subsidies in energy. Why, sir, I ask you, didn't you get an exemption so we could continue to have subsidies in our own regional development programs?
Mr. Broadbent, could you read for me an article in the Free Trade Agreement that would inhibit our capacity to act on behalf of regional development across this country?
There's a section that talks about subsidies. You know that over the next 5 to 7 years, the definition is going to be finally settled on. But the only exemption for subsidies that specifically mention, that you know, is on energy. And that's because the Americans, for the first time in the history of our country, are guaranteed by your government to be able to buy our energy resources at the same price as Canadians, and there's nothing we can do about it.
Mr. Broadbent, there is not the slightest justification in that agreement. There is not a word that would justify what you have been doing, going around trying to scare senior Canadians, senior citizens, in saying that there is something in the Free Trade Agreement that would justify or suggest or empower the government of Canada as a result of this free trade agreement to affect pensions, to affect our capacity for regional development. There is nothing in that agreement in the slightest, sir. And I submit to you that you have, perhaps inadvertently, have been very seriously misleading Canadians, because
quite deliberately, I've been telling them what can happen with this deal, and I can quote business people all across the country who are saying the same thing.
Forget the business. Is there anything in the agreement that impacts upon our right that would stop the government of Canada from engaging in the kinds of regional development programs that we have going on right now?
What's in the agreement what's in the agreement, as you know, is the definition of what constitutes a subsidy, has not been agreed upon. It has to be settled over the next 5 to 7 years. But the only subsidy that is allowed and that you negotiate and put in there is in energy. And you could have got an exemption. Why didn't you get an exemption and say all regional development programs in the future will be exempt from countervail? You didn't do that, and the Americans, as you well know, in a fish case in Atlantic Canada, talked about our social programs constituting a subsidy, and they have every intention of getting us, as businessmen understand, to accept their rules of the game instead of the Canadian rules of the game.
Mr. Broadbent, there is not the slightest justification in the free trade agreement. You're talking about negotiations 5 or 7 years from now. My instructions at that time, if I'm still honored with this position, will be exactly the instructions I gave Ambassador Reisman, which is why you don't see it, why you can't point to it, sir.
Well, I can point to it in energy.
You cannot. I asked you about regional development because you've been going around the country, talking regional development and talking about decisions that would impact on senior citizens. That, sir, is wrong. There is not the slightest word in that free trade agreement that gives you the right to make that kind of argument, because it does not exist. You, sir, are talking about a negotiation that might take place in the next 5 or 7 years, and which could give rise to a situation which you might deplore. Last night I told you that as Prime Minister I would give Ambassador Reisman precisely the same instructions in the future in regard to negotiations of subsidies as we gave him in the past, which is why Simon Reisman came back and said, Prime Minister, in this agreement there is not the slightest capacity as a result of this agreement for any impact on old age pensions, on our capacity for regional development, or any of those social programs. And sir, I think you owe it to the Canadian people to acknowledge that there is no justification for what you've been doing. You've been scaremongering.
Quite the opposite. I want you to answer a direct question then. The Americans did get the only section in the agreement that specifically permits a subsidy is in the energy sector. I'm sure you would agree with that. That's the only one, and the Americans want it because we as Canadian taxpayers now will subsidize the development of our energy resources, and the Americans are guaranteed to get them at the same price as Canadians. Now, why, I ask you, didn't you get something in there that permitted a subsidy in the arts, that permitted a subsidy for the environment, that permitted a subsidy for regional development? If you considered they were as important as energy, the Americans got it in energy, why didn't Canadians get it in these areas?
Mr. Broadbent, in the area, for example, you mentioned the arts. In the area of the arts, this has been very carefully examined by the Economic Council of Canada, Dr. Judith Maxwell, who examined it very carefully. She came to the conclusion with her colleagues that there is not the slightest possibility of doubt in regard to our capacity to have protected fully the cultural industries as we have done. They are exempt, sir, from the agreement. The government of Quebec,
I'm sorry, the countervail can be taken. As you know, certain parts of the culture...
May I just finish,
sorry,
please?
Go ahead.
I think we'd agree that if there was a government in Canada more sensitive about cultural and linguistic concerns, it would obviously be the government of Quebec. The government of Quebec, which is a liberal government, caused to be examined by a parliamentary commission, many, many sessions, this entire agreement, which they endorse, and very specifically in their report to the people of Quebec, they say that we sought an exemption for cultural industries, and cultural industries under this free trade agreement are fully protected. The province and the federal government can do exactly what they wish in terms of giving further grants and support and subsidies to the arts, which we have continued to do, Mr. Broadbent.
But will you admit, I know that your trade spokesperson hasn't read the agreement, Mr. Crosby publicly acknowledged that, but that there's also a clause on the subject we're talking about, the arts and the culture policy, that says that if we do subsidize, say, the federal government or the provincial governments, provide money as is part of our Canadian tradition to encourage the arts, the Americans can take countervailing action if they decide, in their judgment, that constitutes a subsidy. Will you admit that there's a clause in there, specifically in terms of cultural industries, that permits the Americans to take countervailing action?
Mr. Broadbent,
is it there or isn't it? That's a simple question.
With or without a free trade agreement, there can be countervails on both sides. We didn't.
Well, is it in the agreement or isn't it? They can.
Mr. Broadbent, please let him answer the question.
Yeah. Well, he's not answering it.
Well,
Mr. Mulroney?
I'm trying to answer, Mr. Broadbent. I am just saying that reference to cultural industries in the agreement in no way affects the right of the government of the government of Canada or any of the provinces to act fully on behalf of the performing arts, to act fully without any inhibition of any kind.
It just says the Americans can take action against us if you do. That means it's worse than it's useless.
Mr. Broadbent, with or without a free trade agreement, there are countervails that exist in the United States and in Canada that will, and all other countries, and under rules that I think the GATT not only acknowledges and supports, but I think that if you look at the evidence, if you look at the evidence on social programs and cultural programs, as for example, an independent organization like the Economic Council of Canada has said, there's no justification, sir, for your fears whatsoever. You should rest assured in that regard, and I think you've gotten good endorsements from the government of Quebec, from the Economic Council of Canada, and so many others.
Thank you, gentlemen. We'll move on to the next question from David Halton, please.
Thanks, Isabella. Mr. Broadbent, we heard you paint a pretty grim picture of how our subsidies for regional development, social programs, and so on would be under great danger under free trade. We heard Mr. Mulroney serve up Valiums to us. No, they won't be affected at all. But how can Canadians take either of you seriously when the subsidy issue wasn't agreed on by the negotiators? The clock ran out. They said we're going to spend the next 5 and 7 years negotiating these things. How will we know how that issue is resolved until those negotiations are over?
Two very important points. Mr. Reisman, who was the chief negotiator, said a year ago November in a speech in Winnipeg that the Americans who wanted to have all these matters, the subsidies question defined, were going after our social programs. It was Mr. Reisman who said that, not me, by the way. He listed them all, but there was no final agreement. So they buried that to have it finally resolved over the next 5 to 7 years in definition. And does anyone believe that in terms of when that definition is reached, that we as a country that have a tenth of the population and a tenth of the economic clout of the United States, that the Americans are going to accept our rules when they finally decide it? Even democratically, if they do it in a number of counts, we should more reasonably accept their rules when the final definition comes. But in the meantime, what is happening, say on social policy, and I quote from, I can give you a half a dozen business people. I've given one tonight. I could give many more. They're saying there's great pressure in all our businesses now, by our businesses, to say we can't keep up these taxes. We have to compete with the U.S., so we have to lower our pension programs. We have to lower our Medicare schemes. We have to harmonize to the lowest common denominator, which is the U.S. That's what's going on right now. There was an ad the other day in the Globe and Mail. Say, move your industry to Georgia, or whatever state it was, saying because you don't have to worry about the environment, you don't have to worry about trade unions, there are lower labor costs, and that's precisely the harmonization that's going on now. The third point is, of course, there's special, I've already mentioned it, subsidies that are permitted in the energy sector. They are spelled out, but they aren't permitted in there in regional development. And everyone, I think every economist I know, whether he supports the deal or not, is quite convinced that the American rules will finally prevail in this, and not the Canadian.
Well, I think,
Mr. Mulroney, there are just 1.5 minutes left
and I'll just be very
in
brief.
this debate.
There's a very interesting acknowledgement by the leader of the NDP that there is nothing in the agreement now that justifies his apprehensions. What he is concerned about is in the future. He's talking about what might emerge as a result of negotiations in 5 or 7 years. There's a world of difference between what might happen and what is in the agreement, and there is nothing in the agreement whatsoever to justify the alarmist positions that he has taken in regard to the elderly in Canada, programs of regional development. I mean, it's absolutely preposterous to consider that, for example, Premier Frank McKenna, who's a Liberal Premier in New Brunswick, in a province which desperately needs regional development, which desperately needs social programs, would for a second contemplate endorsing an agreement that didn't provide for full protection in those two areas. So we have protected those two areas and many others, and I'm pleased to be able to see Mr. Broadbent tonight acknowledging that the problem is not now, it's not in the text, it's somewhere down the road.
Mr. Broadbent, a few seconds of rebuttal.
That's of course not what I said at all. The problem is very real, very present now. Pressure is being put on to harmonize, and quite categorically, we have exemptions in the deal for subsidies in energy, which is what the Americans want. We didn't get an exception made for regional development, culture, and the environment, which is what we want. Mr. Mulroney knows that.
Thank you, gentlemen. We've now completed the 3 debates of the first round, and we now begin the second hour with Mr. Mulroney and Mr. Turner. The questions in this section, although relevant to all Canadians, are of particular concern to women, and the first question goes to Pamela Wallen.
Thank you. When the Supreme Court ruled on the abortion issue, it really put the onus on the politicians, on the political leaders, to do just that on this issue, to lead. Neither of you really has stated what your party position would be. Surely Canadians have a right to know what you would do on this issue, how you would attempt, as you did in the capital punishment debate, to convince your own members of Parliament and through them the public on this issue. Can you give us some clear answers over and above just your personal opinions, but how you would as party leaders lead on this issue?
Well, Ms. Wallen, we of course dealt with this issue very thoroughly last night, but I think we should deal with it before our English-speaking audience. It's a very delicate moral issue. It's a very personal issue. It's a social issue as well. And abortion is always the last decision any woman wants to make. And if she does, I'm sure she always does it with great anguish. It's the responsibility of government to introduce legislation, to fill the response needed by the Supreme Court of Canada decision 9-10 months ago. I had that responsibility when I was Minister of Justice in 1969, and I brought in the legislation that was struck down by the Supreme Court. That was the legislation, as you recall, that provided that an abortion was exempt from the criminal code if for therapeutic purposes where the life or health of the mother was in danger, it was performed by a registered doctor. I exercised that responsibility. Mr. Mulroney had that responsibility during the last 9 months as Prime Minister, and he failed to bring in a bill There were multiple choice resolutions. There was difficulty in parliamentary procedure, but he didn't present a piece of legislation to which we could constructively respond. A Liberal government will bring in legislation immediately after the reassembly of a new parliament. We will bring in a bill which will respect the decision of the Supreme Court of Canada. We will have a free vote for members of parliament. And I will consult my caucus, of course, get the general tone of the House of Commons, and introduce a bill into the House.
Thank you, Mr. Turner. Ms. Mulroney?
I think, in fairness, Madam Chairman, I can endorse a lot of what the Leader of the Opposition has said in regard to this very sensitive and difficult and most important moral issue that has religious and special connotations for women and for families, and presents a special kind of challenge for the legislator, particularly when the legislation to which my honorable friend referred was struck down by the Supreme Court because it was in conflict with the Charter. That left a legislative void that we sought to get a sense of the House on by way of a resolution, perhaps imperfectly, but we sought on such an important social issue, we tried to find out whether there was a consensus in the House. It turned out there was not. The Supreme Court was seized again of another issue, which relates directly to the entire debate, which is presently before the Supreme Court of Canada. As I've indicated many times before, it would be our intention, upon the return of the House, for me to consult actively with the leaders of the other party to depoliticize entirely this issue, to seek a compromise that respects the rights of women and the rights of the fetus, to bring forward a piece of legislation that will, I think, do honor to the kind of civilized country that we believe we are, and, as I've always indicated from the very beginning, make absolutely certain that there is not a party position. I don't think there should be a party position. I don't think that political whips should be imposing party discipline in regard to a matter of strict and fundamental conscience. So I would invite all members of Parliament, including my own, when the proposal is before the House, to exercise their best judgment, not as they're told by party whips or by party leaders, but as their conscience guides them. And I think that we can follow that and achieve a successful conclusion of what is a very difficult issue.
Mr. Turner, any reply?
Well, the fact remains, of course, that the Prime Minister did have the responsibility with his Minister of Justice to bring in a bill that would have responded to the Supreme Court of Canada decision, and he didn't do that. He knows what I will do. I will do it after consulting a new composition in Parliament, a new caucus, a much larger caucus, and also by reviewing the current state of the law as it's handed down by the Supreme Court of Canada, because there's not only the Morgenthaler decision with which we have to deal, there's the Borowski case currently before the court. But it is a matter that needs leadership. Despite the free vote to allow each member to reflect either a constituency view or a personal view, that leadership was not exercised in the last Parliament.
Well, I just conclude, if I may, by saying that I think my honourable friend would agree that the delay, given the circumstances before the court, the delay in parliamentary time has not been abusive. That we did act promptly to seek a consensus in regard to the opinion in the House. It is true that we were not successful. We did not find that consensus that all members could support. But we did act promptly. I thought we acted effectively, and clearly we're going to have to do better as a parliament, as parliamentarians, all of us, to help Canadians solve what is probably the most challenging social issue before us.
Of course, the difficulty was that no bill was presented before the House which could be reviewed by members of the House. The views of the members kept being tested without leadership on the part of the government being exercised.
We thought that it was, given the fact that we wanted to ensure that the member's opinion was respected, the integrity of the independence of his view, like the position I took in the debate on capital punishment, that this was a proper way to proceed. It didn't succeed, but we can come back and make sure that the matter is properly and promptly resolved.
Thank you. Next question, Doug Small, please.
Well, if I may just follow that up, Prime Minister, the things you've been talking about for many women underlying the nut of this issue. This law, when it comes, will be decided by a free vote of members of Parliament. Why won't you let women follow the same set of rules and decide the issue of abortion by following their consciences?
Well, we are going to have to bring forward I've given you my personal point of view. I have also indicated many times that I do not seek to impose my personal values by force on my members of Parliament on an issue like this. I will, of course, as my honourable friend would, speak in the issue as we have on official languages and on Meech Lake and all of the sensitive issues of our time. And that is a very important proposal that you bring forward. I mentioned in my first response the need to attempt, with some sensitivity and understanding, to try and reconcile those two sometimes apparently irreconcilable views. It is the most important wrenching issue that we have. It won't be easy, but I believe we can do it, and we can proceed in full respect of the point of view that you convey in terms of it being understood, being heard, and impacting upon the decision.
Mr. Turner.
Well, the difficulty, of course, with giving a response to that question at this stage is that a response would be premature. I've always believed that the purpose of a legislator in the House of Commons in a pluralistic society where there are opposing views on deep moral issues, whether they be capital punishment or abortion, is to seek the common good, to seek a reconciliation of those views, if that's possible. The reason I say, Mr. Small, it's premature at the moment, we do not know what the composition of the House of Commons is going to be, nor what the views of the members are going to be. I speak particularly of our own caucus. Nor can I predict, at the time I have the responsibility for presenting that bill to Parliament, what the state of the law as determined by the Supreme Court of Canada is going to be.
Mr. Mulroney, any reply?
But when you indicate the concept of a free vote, it has to be followed completely. And I can indicate to you, because we were all very much involved, for example, in the one on capital punishment, that I followed it to the extent that when we arrived in the House of Commons for the vote on that important evening, as the Speaker or the clerk was about to call the roll, I said to Mr. Mazinkowski, who was my seatmate, Maz, how do you think Michael Wilson, who sits right next to me on the left, is going to vote? And that was the first indication that I had received of how Mr. Wilson might vote on the issue of capital punishment. I think that's the way we ought to proceed. Let our members consider this matter only being guided by their own conscience and stand up in the House, explain themselves, and take a vote.
David Holton, you have the next question.
Mr. Turner, you've said that the Conservative child care plan is fatally flawed because it doesn't have national standards in it. Your plan proposes those standards. I'd like to ask you how you're going to impose them on the provinces when the provinces, in fact, are largely in charge, under their jurisdiction, the whole issue of child care.
Well, I would think that now that Meech Lake agreement among the provinces and the federal government defines the ability of the federal government to use and exercise the spending power of Parliament in areas of provincial jurisdiction, allows a child care program to be delivered on a national basis.
But there are no binding standards.
The standards suggest that in order for the provinces to opt out of a national plan, they would have to have a plan that's compatible with the national plan. Obviously, any national criteria would have to be effective, be negotiated with the provinces. Our quarrel with Mr. Mulroney's plan is clear. First of all, despite the fact that we debated this issue 4 years ago, and we both made a commitment to present a child care plan to the people of Canada, Mr. Mulroney waited until July 26th of this year to introduce a plan into the House of Commons. It wasn't brought forward with any speed at all. Then closure or limitation on debate was imposed. Public hearings were limited to 2 days, and I can tell you that virtually every witness who appeared said that the plan was inadequate. First, it went nowhere near attempting to fill and provide the number of spaces we need for child care in this country, 1,600,000 at least. This has become a crisis for Canadian families, a crisis for the men and women who need an opportunity to have their children supervised and looked after to open up employment opportunities and income opportunities. Now, the plan doesn't do that. It doesn't go near to provide the spaces. It doesn't go near to provide national standards. It relies heavily on the tax system in favor of the wealthier groups of our society, and it's an entirely unbalanced plan which is not met with the approval of any of the experts on the subject. Our plan would double the number of spaces envisaged by Mr. Mulrooney. It would cost $10 billion over 7 years compared to $7 billion for Mr. Mulrooney's plan, of which $4 billion would be in the first 4 years. It would be flexible, it would be accessible, and it would be a proper balance in sharing costs between those parents who can and employers and governments, but would always be open to those in need. That's the type of plan we need. That's the type of plan Mr. Mulrooney has not provided.
Mr. Mulrooney?
Well, the child care plan, of course, is $6.4 billion, is probably the most important social advance in Canada since the Canada Pension Plan. It is a very, very important thing, particularly important for working women and for Canadian families. The Leader of the Opposition is, of course, quite wrong when he says we didn't proceed with any degree of speed. We immediately began what we should have done, taking it up with the premiers and the health ministers. I raised it, and it was an important agenda item at the First Minister's Conference on the economy. Barbara McDougall was one of the key players in making sure that it was brought forward. There were intensive discussions, endless discussions, as you might imagine, with the provinces in such a sensitive area, which is by and large a provincial jurisdiction. We agreed upon a plan which would be have the effect of increasing from 200,000 to 400,000 the number of spaces available over a period of 7 years. Not a miracle, but a very major step forward on behalf of Canadian women and Canadian families. It was balanced. It is flexible. It meets, for example, the fact of life that the requirements, say, in metropolitan Toronto for child care are different from those in Labrador West or in Come By Chance. And this, too, has to be taken into account, that the flexibility of various programs has to be adapted. But there are fundamental standards and norms that will be adopted between the province and the federal government, without which, of course, you couldn't have the kind of national plan that I think we have successfully developed. And so while I will acknowledge that it is not perfect, and that I suppose that with vast amounts of money we could do more, it's a huge expenditure on behalf of Canadian women and families, and I think it represents the kind of initiative that can be improved upon, as we've improved upon the Canadian pension plans over the years, but I think it will be regarded as landmark legislation in favor of Canadian working women and Canadian families.
Mr. Turner.
Well, the reason, of course, we have no legislation is that Mr. Mulrooney did not fulfill his commitment to the Canadian people that he made 4 years ago in 1984. He delayed and procrastinated and didn't bring the bill in until July 26th of this year. He formed a government September 17, 1984. He brought in the legislation July 26, 1988. That's not any evidence of sincerity, and that isn't any evidence of his commitment to what I believe is a national crisis. And his plan, your plan, sir, has no national standards. You cannot allow the provinces to vary in their support to what is a national problem. Yes, you consult. Yes, you negotiate. But you exercise your responsibility as leader of a government to meet what I believe is the prominent social crisis of our time. Supervision of our children, when working men and women need that help in order to expand employment opportunities, and you did not live up to your commitment to the Canadian people.
We have indeed, and it is now passed the House of Commons, and it was only being held up by the Liberals in the Senate.
Let me answer that.
Mr. Turner, very quickly.
It was brought to the Senate 2 or 3 days before the election. The senators went to the House leader, the conservative House leader in the Senate, and said, give us 8 more hours, give us 3 more hours, let us finish the hearings, let us pass the bill. This Prime Minister, Mr. Mulrooney, wouldn't delay the election 3 hours to allow that bill to go through because he had some private commitments.
One of the great ironies is that the Liberal Party was asking for an election. Let the people decide, they said. And then when we had the child care bill, the Liberals in the Senate said, hold on, we want to delay. Give us a little more time.
We offered to pass that bill. You couldn't wait 3 hours.
The time is now up. in this encounter. The next encounter will be between Mr. Turner and Mr. Broadbent. Next question, please, from Pamela Wallen.
On the question of pay equity, I guess the news, you'd have to say, is not very good. Women aren't doing a whole lot better than they were 10 years ago, even 20 years ago. Voluntary rules for the federally regulated sector haven't really worked. The private sector, of course, have no rules. Would either of you, or both of you, if elected, favor mandatory rules for the public and the private sector? And what do you say to businesses who argue they simply can't survive, they can't afford it, Mr. Brown?
The answer is yes. I would favor mandatory rules, as I did in 1984 in the debate that we had, as Mr. Mulroney promised at that time he would do it, and of course he did no such thing in the 4 years he's been in power. It makes sense to come to grips with the very severe inequality that exists. We know women now are getting approximately 65% of pay that men get. The only way to do it is to make it mandatory. First of all, you do it in federal jurisdiction. You apply it throughout the federal civil service, and then you do it with corporations that the government's dealing with. You make it a condition of getting government contracts. You say you either have this practice in place or you don't get it. You don't do business. You do that, by the way, not only in the pay equity, but you do it in affirmative action programs too. We have to use the authority that we have. They've done it in the United States. Some companies haven't liked it. Other companies, by the way, have responded very positively and have said so publicly. And it's long overdue, and we should get on with it.
Mr. Turner?
Well, Madam Chair, I two issues here. One is employment equity, and I believe we should move strongly in affirmative action to ensure that that happens, particularly in the case of women who are facing double discrimination, women from minority groups, immigrant women, and so on. I think what we have now under the conservative legislation and under conservative practice is a reactive situation where there has to be an appeal system through the public service, and in extreme cases to the Canadian Human Rights Commission. We need a proactive posture in Canada on employment equity. That is to say, the right of women to have equal access to jobs and promotional opportunities. On pay equity, I believe it's a mandatory situation. I support what's happened in Ontario, the Government of Ontario legislation. I think it ought to be mandatory, first within the federal public service and the agencies attached to the federal government. I think, secondly, with corporations and individuals that deal with the federal public service and the Government of Canada, and I think we have to consider it to be mandatory within areas of federal jurisdiction.
Can I add a footnote? Mr. Turner is now saying this, but as he knows, we've got pay equity legislation in place in Ottawa. It's supposed to be operational now. I'm not talking about the companies doing business with the government. I'm talking about the government itself. And we had it under the Liberal government. And it was notorious. Human rights groups, women's groups, for years complained that it wasn't being enforced. The legislation was there, but there was no mechanism to make it work. You, sir, it was your party that was there during this period when we had legislation on the books was being ignored. Now, once again, election time, we're talking about the issue, and it's convenient. I'm not questioning motive here. I'm simply saying you're talking about it now, but when your government was in place, that legislation was there, but it wasn't made operational. Mr. Mulroney came along in 1984 and said, oh, vote for us, vote for the Conservatives, and we'll not only make the legislation that's on the books work, but he said then we would also extend it to the private sector, to companies that do business with the government. He didn't do it. You had legislation in place that was not made operational. People of Canada, and my frank view, if they're concerned about equity, if women are concerned, should vote neither Liberal nor Conservative.
Well, Mr. Broadbent loves holding me historically responsible for whatever he perceives to be the gaps of the past. He knows that when we stood here 4 years ago with Mr. Mulroney, I made as strong a commitment as he did to mandatory enforcement of pay equity and affirmative action for employment equity. Our members in the House of Commons took those positions consistently during the 4 years that we served in opposition. So I'm glad he says he doesn't want to question motives. He can bear, I think, witness to my testimony to him and to the country that those are the positions we have taken consistently since I've been leader of the Liberal Party of Canada.
Next question for Doug Smallty.
Mr. Turner, your support for Meech Lake has usurped debate on an issue, the fair delivery of services, that women's groups say is crucial to them. From their point of view, you put your political interests in Quebec ahead of women's interests. What guarantees can you give women tonight that you won't sacrifice their interests in the future on this altar of political expediency?
I think, Mr. Small, you followed the scene very, very closely over the last 2 or 3 years. If anybody took political heat for support of Meech Lake, I took it. I took it throughout the country, particularly from Liberals, and certainly after the intervention of my predecessor, Pierre Trudeau, into the scene. So my commitment did not look for political advantage. My commitment was to the country. I believed and still believe that with all its faults, the Meech Lake Accord has as an overwhelming purpose bringing Quebec fully into the Canadian family, constitutionally, psychologically, and politically. It has areas that I believe can be improved. I wouldn't reopen the Meech Lake Accord. I believe it's important that it be signed and ratified by all the provinces. Now, we presented 9 amendments into the House of Commons and the same amendments into the Senate. Among those amendments were to make it clear that the charter rights of women were absolutely set forth in unambiguous terms. We also did the same for Aboriginal government, the constitutional recognition of inherent Aboriginal rights of our Native people. We did it in terms of recognizing the multicultural condition and aspects of our country. So I can say to the women of Canada that our constitutional program, and it's part of the platform before you in this election, is to complete Meech Lake for the purposes of national unity, but to use the amendments we put forward into the House of Commons and in the Senate as our ongoing constitutional commitment for further negotiation with the Premiers.
Mr. Broadbent?
Quick observation. First of all, I as leader, my caucus would have had nothing to do with the Meech Lake Accord if we seriously believed that women's rights were threatened. And I say that with total conviction. We worked very hard in 1981-82, the first round of constitutional change, to make sure the equality provision for women was put in there. It was a big struggle. The women of Canada led the struggle. If I may say so, I think our caucus played the leading role in the House to get that part of the package in 81-82. The reality is, in terms of the Meech Lake Accord, I personally sat down with representatives of the omnibus women's group in the province of Quebec, who are feminist activists, lawyers in this particular case, the Fédération des Femmes du Québec, and they supported the accord. And they said, in their view, it was not going to threaten women's groups. If there had been a serious judgment to take people like Pauline Jewett in my caucus, who's worked very hard for women's rights, Margaret Mitchell and others, going back many years, you can be sure if we thought that they were threatened, we would not have supported the Meech Lake Accord. I do not believe they're threatened. I believe the accord is good.
Any reply, Mr. Turner?
Well, we set forth a full constitutional agenda in response to Meech Lake, both in the House of Commons and the Senate. We believe that Meech Lake, plus our amendments, presents Canadians with a balanced federalism, and equilibrium for the future. Enhancing the Charter, minority language rights, rights of women, rights of our Aboriginal people, further flexibility into the process to move towards an elected Senate, recognizing the unfairness towards the Yukon and Northwest Territories in the Meech Lake Accord. I think we have a program that we set out very fully on future constitutional progress, which I commend to Canadians.
Thank you. David Halton?
Mr. Broadbent, on another issue, you've criticized the Tories for spending too much on defense, on nuclear-powered subs and so on, and not enough on social programs. But defense experts have looked at your own defense critics' policy for rearming Canada's armed forces and found that in fact would cost almost as much as the 185 billion the Tories would spend over the next 15 years or so. Aren't you being a tad hypocritical as the leader of the self-proclaimed Party of Peace, in fact, coming up with a defense re-equipment program that would cost every bit as much as the Tories?
Interesting to have a defense question on women's issues. That
They're
we're
very
supposed
interested.
To, well,
There was a brief reference at the beginning, I believe.
And I'm really very happy to talk about it. The reality is that our defense program, when it's announced in detail, as we will be during the end of this, before the end of the campaign, as I have said, unlike Mr. Turner, by the way, and maybe Mr. Turner will comment on this aspect of the question. His party's promised to spend some $29 billion and hasn't said where they're going to get the money. But we have itemized every day of this campaign an announcement how much it will cost. And I have made a commitment to the people of Canada. We will be saying what the revenue flows will be and what the tax changes and who's going to pay before this election. We'll be doing the same on defense spending, and it simply is not the case that it's anywhere near of what the Conservative commitment would be in the next 4 years, and we'll spell it out. We have a limited expenditure budget for frigates, new frigates, for conventional submarines, for some other commitments in military spending, which we think are necessary, even though, as you correctly imply, our emphasis as a country, we believe, should be on contributing to the global disarmament process. We still need a defense policy for the sovereignty of Canada. But we will be saying, I repeat, how much it will cost. And I also emphasize it's nowhere near what the Conservatives will be spending, and we'll indicate that very clearly before the end of this election.
Mr. Turner?
Well, Madam Chair, I don't accept in any way the figure attributed to our costing, and we will have by the end of the campaign, we're costing our programs one by one, and we will have a year-by-year analysis during the mandate of a government of how much it will cost, and I hope Mr. Broadbent will do the same. Now, when it gets down to defense spending, here is the interesting problem for Canadians. The New Democratic Party is bound by this resolution, B43 of New Democratic policy. Be it resolved that the New Democratic Party confirm its commitment to peace and disarmament by reaffirming its policy calling for Canadian withdrawal from NATO and other military alliances. The NDP has never told us how they would regulate their future relationships with the United States in defense if that were done. They've never told us how the country could pursue a successful arms control policy if that were done. And they've never done, Mr. Halton, in response to your question, is to tell Canadians how much it would cost if we were to withdraw from the alliances and have to set up the entire defense mechanism on our own without any American participation or any European participation. And I venture to say, if you look at the Swedish precedent, I venture to say that Mr. Broadbent and his party, if they lived up to this commitment, instead of trying to blur it, would leave us with about a $100 billion commitment on defense because there would be no participation from our allies at all. On defense equipment, here again, the New Democratic Party has been vague. They say that their commitment is as ambitious as the Conservatives. Now I hear Mr. Broadbent saying he wants to scale it down. And I would think that before this election is over, I would like to know, and I believe Canadians deserve to know, how firm is the commitment to pull out of NORAD and NATO? You are bound by these policies. How much would it cost to set up our own unique isolationist defense program, and where would you be able to find future cooperation from our former allies?
Mr. Broadbent, I'm sure this issue will arise again. I will, of course, give you an opportunity to reply. That oblique reference to social issues turns out not to be a reference to women, so I would ask you to keep your reply brief.
Madam Chairperson, I'm in your hands because I would very much like to have this discussion, but I'm very sensitive to the fact that we're supposed to be talking about women's issues. If there could be some agreement that when we go into the next hour of the agenda, somehow part of this time will be open to dealing with this issue, I would be very happy to deal with it. But I repeat, conscious of the fact we're supposed to be talking about women's matters.
I would think that Mr. Broadbent ought to be allowed equal time on this. I'm interested as a Canadian to know what he would do, but I was just responding to Mr. Halton's question, as I believe he was.
Mr. Turner, what I will do, since the intervention came from a journalist when it wasn't expected and turned out not to deal with women's issues, that we will assume that the journalist will again give you an opportunity to respond to that issue, and I'd like to move on to the next issue dealing with women from Pamela Wallingford.
All right, if I can just say that in our discussions, we felt that women were in fact very interested in these issues and in the spending of defense funds. But if you would like another issue, we would like to hear from both of you as well on the question of, we've heard a little bit tonight about the daycare programs and about the national standards issue and whether or not you can really get care of equal quality from coast to coast under Meech Lake. I'd like to put it a little differently to both of you. Both of your programs as proposed have been quite limited and quite restricted. Women's groups across the country say that neither one of them comes even remotely close to filling the actual need in this country. Can we go back to the very basic issue? Do you support and would you, over the course of a government, provide universally funded, universally accessible daycare?
Gentlemen, there are only 2 minutes left in this round. I just remind you of that so that everybody has a chance to answer that question, and that's to Mr. Turner first.
Well, we believe in universal accessibility, and our program, however, does contemplate sharing the costs between parents and employers and governments, with special attention to the lower income families who should have complete access to it. Our program differs from the New Democratic program, although I heard Mr. Broadbent shading that a bit last evening. His program, as I understand it, is a public program, pure and simple. I think the costs would be, at this stage, unsustainable within the current financial commitments of the country. And the right of parents to have the responsibility and control of their children under the program contemplated by the NDP, I don't believe is there.
Mr. Broadbent?
Well, I frankly don't know what Mr. Turner is talking about. We have spelled out a program with great care that would put in place some 200,000 spaces over the next 4 years, unlike Mr. Mulroney's, who's spending more money and would take 7 years to get the same number of spaces, because we want to put the priority on making spaces available. And it's flexible spaces. It's in neighborhoods. Some families will want to use a neighborhood home. Other people will want to use, as I was in Yellowknife not long ago, a very unconventional kind of daycare facility there, different from what you would find in urban Canada. We want variety in spaces. We want money to be put up for it. We want to meet the varying needs of Canadian families, in particular women. And let me take another special category.
I'm going to have to allow Mr. Turner a quick response because the round is over. And sorry to interject.
I don't want Mr. Broadbent to feel flattered, but I've read his program very carefully, and I hear him now, as he did last night, shading away from that entirely public-dominated program.
What's shading away?
I don't believe there's the flexibility in your program for the non-profit, profit mix with I believe, a bias towards a non-profit. I don't think there's the flexibility as between the wealthier and non-wealthier families of the country. I think it has a rigid aspect about it that it does not provide the flexibility that Mr. Broadbent now contends.
Well, thank you, Mr. Turner and Mr. Broadbent. I regret these were time limits that everyone had agreed to, and the encounter is over. Mr. Broadbent will now debate Mr. Mulroney, and the first question is from Doug Small.
Mr. Mulroney, in the 1984 women's debate, you said homemaker pensions and help for battered women would be top priorities. You haven't delivered on homemaker pensions, and help for battered women has been described by women's groups as miserly at best. How do you explain this to women when you manage to find $8 billion for nuclear-powered subs?
Well, we have, Mr. Small, begun the process of delivering on homemakers' pensions as a result of the federal-provincial, because it is provincial jurisdiction as well, the federal-provincial task force that was established, which has finally, after a lot of work with the provinces, reported back. I'll acknowledge that we couldn't do everything overnight when we came in and inherited a very bad fiscal situation, as you know, but it remains an important priority for us. It will be done. Homemakers are entitled to that pension. And we are working now, and have worked, I think, very successfully with the provinces to develop, in much the same way as we have with childcare, a strategy that is fiscally viable and attractive and helpful to women. With regard to your comment, Mr. Small, about battered women, I don't know of a crime more cowardly than that. The abuse of women, violence against women in the home or outside. We have taken some very important initiatives to help women to build shelters, to help Native women who are abused. There's a multicultural component to what we have done. But I also think in terms of battered women, if I may, I suppose it's not really on the spending part of your question. I've been very troubled, quite frankly, and have discussed it in the month of May, publicly, by the state of the criminal law in regard to battered women, where a woman who's battered, she goes on trial. She is interrogated and abused, if I may put it that way, humiliated, and while she is trying to state a case, she is the victim. She becomes the accused. Now, I'm a lawyer by trade. I know the presumptions of innocence, and I know the manner in which the criminal law must function and the presumptions that have to exist. But I have to tell you that I have been saddened and shocked by what I believe is a current in our conduct of the law that is unfair, I believe, in its application to women. And I think that the criminal court...
Mr. Mulroney?
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. I would like Mr. Broadbent to have an opportunity to respond.
Thank you. Well, as is frequently the case, when Mr. Mulroney gets a question about what his government hasn't done, instead of dealing with the issue, he talks about something else. On the very serious problem of battered women, for example, this government brought in a bill, if you would believe it, that would provide $10 per year for each battered woman in the country. And it is worse than insulting. Every women's group, every social concern group, church group in the country thought it was atrocious to try to pretend that something was being done about what is a very serious social problem in Canada. There's a number of women who are battered. When one of our members raised this in the House of Commons in the past couple of years, Margaret Mitchell, in fact, there was a great deal of laughter, which was outrageous. So the government hasn't done anything, didn't live up to its commitment. In fact, was, as I say, it brought in $10 per battered woman per year. And again, Mr. Mulroney mentioned his child care program. Again, it's a sham. Every women's group has appropriately condemned it. The amount of money spent and the programming that's gone into it will produce fewer child care spaces over the next 7 years than would have been the case had the government not done anything. What the government did was bring in a major tax break scheme that went disproportionately to upper income people instead of putting money into child care spaces. So if you had left the whole thing alone in place, we would have had more child care spaces. So whether we're talking about child care spaces or whether we're talking about battered women, your government, sir, has been a complete failure.
Mr. Mulroney?
Well, Mr. Broadbent has developed quite a gift and a capacity to trivialize important issues. Everything that is done, everything that we do on behalf of women or minorities or natives, it is never enough, never costs enough.
Not so. I didn't mention native people today.
It's never done quickly enough. All of a sudden now child care, a $6.4 billion commitment, that's not proper. That's not enough. Simply because, I suppose, it doesn't meet with Mr. Broadbent's definition of what is proper. We consulted Parliament. We consult the provinces. They have a different view of what is taking place. I point out to Mr. Broadbent as well, in this very important area, about the amendments that we have brought to the Divorce Act, the Family Violence Initiative, the National Drug Strategy, the extension of spousal allowances, the fact that we've eliminated discrimination against Native women.
What's that got to do with the question that was asked?
What it has to do is the fact that anytime anything is mentioned as to what the government has done or what the Canadian people have been able to do, you seem to, perhaps I'm wrong, but you seem to sort of dismiss it as never being enough, never being proper, never up to your high standards. No. Only you and the NDP have the solutions to everything. You know, the rest of us try pretty hard, too, to bring about proper solutions to serious problems.
Well, that might be persuasive if every women's group and child care advocacy group, sir, hadn't condemned your legislation. Because, would you deal with the point? Why didn't you put the concentration of the money all the sums you've allocated on the creation of new spaces that are needed in Canada, right from Newfoundland through to British Columbia, instead of giving so many millions of dollars in terms of tax concessions to upper-income kids, upper-income families. Not a working woman in downtown Toronto is going to benefit because she's not going to get the child care space. That's what my criticism, not mine, child care advocacy groups, women's groups, not New Democrats, women who are concerned about child care spaces, sir, have condemned your program as simply another handout for the rich instead of putting money into spaces that were needed. It's not my criticism.
Well, I'll tell you, this is something new. That this $6.4 billion program designed to help working women is now a handout for the rich.
How much of it is going for spaces?
Mr. Broadbent
Tell us how much is going for spaces.
Who did I listen to? I'll tell you who I listened to in regard to this. I listened to the 6 members of the federal cabinet, which is the largest number of women ever to serve in a cabinet in Canadian history, including 3, for the first time in history, who are on P&P, the important executive committee of cabinet. That's who I listened to.
Why didn't you hear child care advocacy groups?
Women who go, well, why should I listen to an advocacy group necessarily, although I do?
Because they have care and expertise in the area.
Outstanding women, expertise in the area. What about Barbara McDougall and Flora MacDonald and Pat Carney?
What about them? If they supported this program, then I'm ashamed of the fact. They should have condemned the program.
You're ashamed of
Canada's children. There's
some of the most outstanding women in the history of Canadian politics.
We're talking about child care.
I took my advice and counsel from them. I believe they're outstanding women who have lived the problems themselves, in many cases, who are fully acquainted with the needs, who have Barbara McDougall is, apart from being, for example, a senior cabinet minister, as a member of P&P, and Flora MacDonald is responsible for much of the social legislation in the last number of years in Canada. Barbara McDougall, apart from being a senior cabinet minister in employment and immigration, is also the minister responsible for the status of women.
That has nothing to do with child care. I thought we were talking about child care.
She's the key architect of the child care plan. Well, she went out as a woman, as someone whose concerns perhaps she can articulate better than you or I, Mr. Broadbent. And she came back with a program that she believed served the needs of Canadians and Canadian women. And I want to tell you, she wasn't preaching for the rich. She was preaching for Canadian women who needed help. And this program reflects that reality.
Well, if she wasn't preaching for the rich, she gave most of the benefits for the rich. And everyone who knows anything about child care has condemned the program because we aren't going to get spaces for working women who badly need them.
David Halton, your question, please.
Mr. Broadbent, we heard you a few moments ago denouncing the conservative daycare program on the grounds that it's a handout to the rich. If that's the case, why do you support uncritically the principle of universal social programs, which are programs that aren't targeted to those most in need?
Oh, first of all, we support all such money going out as being part of taxable income. So you, Mr. Halton, as a well-paid journalist, myself as a well-paid member of Parliament, I don't know if you have children, but if you have, you get family allowances that go into your family, as I do, and we pay taxes on it. So no matter what your income is, you pay tax on that money you get. I think that unlike the United States, and this is the crucial social point about this country that makes us so different, and if I may say so desirable, we have universal programs, whether it's pensions, whether it's Medicare, or whether it's family allowance, because we define them as characteristics of citizenship. The United States, the only developed industrial country almost left in the world, defines all such things as charity. And therefore you have a hard time making progress in the United States. That's why you have not only 36 million Americans have no health insurance, you have another 50 million that have very mediocre insurance because they don't make their programs universal. That's the point I'm talking about. If we have social policy that we think is desirable, if we think it's good, whether it's Medicare or whether it's family allowance, that human beings growing up in our country get those benefits, then the best social policy, in my judgment, is to make sure everyone gets them as a right of citizenship, and you take it, if you like, out of the market mechanism. You don't treat it as a charity. But then if it's an income program, by God, yes, you pay progressive income tax rates on it. And make sure, as we're advocating in this election, unlike the Conservatives, that the richest Canadians pay a little more on income tax basis, including on those programs.
Thank you, Mr. Mulroney.
Well, I think the best, my friend Mr. Broadbent refers to the best social policy, which is an important matter. I believe the best social policy is a job. And since I've had the honor of being Prime Minister, Canada has created 1,300,000 new jobs. But what's important about it is that 57% of those jobs have gone to women. 728,000 women have found work since this government has been sworn in. And 83% of those jobs, which have gone to women, have been full-time, reversing completely a trend under our predecessors where the tendency was towards part-time work. So I believe that the expanding, growing economy that we have brought about benefits, if it's properly done, and I think it has been, principally women, as it should, particularly those who need durable jobs. And if you look at the results of the last 4 years, where we've led the industrialized world, I think it's a great tribute to Canadians. And I'm personally delighted that the manner in which the various economic strategies that we've developed have resulted in this tremendous degree of social justice for Canadian women. What could be more important to a woman seeking employment than the availability of a good, durable, high-paying job? And that is what we have provided. And that is the mother lode of social programs. That is the growing economy, the new pool of wealth that allows us to pay for a lot of these social programs that Canada desires.
Mr. Broadbent,
yes,
please.
I'd like to comment on that. Mr. Mulroney went off on another tangent and didn't deal with the universality problem or problem for Mr. Holton maybe as a question policy that I support, and talked about the new jobs for women. Let me say right away, Mr. Mulroney, that I'm pleased that a number of new jobs clearly have been created for women, but I also note in passing that you committed yourself in 1984 to pay equity, and I note that since you've been in government, the gap between the woman's salary, the average public employee, and the average man's salary as a public employee has widened instead of narrowed, and that you promised in 1984 to take action to make sure the pay equity legislation that was put in place by the Liberals that they didn't act on would be acted upon, and you didn't do that. And I want to ask you, notwithstanding the good news about jobs that have occurred, and I support that out there in the marketplace, in the area where you have direct responsibility and where you made a commitment in 1984 in terms of narrowing that gap between men and women, why didn't you act?
Because we did. We passed the Employment Equity Act that Flora MacDonald was responsible for in the first case. And secondly, we have the Joint Union Management Committee to implement pay equity in the public service that is now going on to Treasury Board under Pat Carney with all of our unions where we are agreeing on a policy of pay equity for women, of equal pay. And this is what has been going on. This is the hard work that is going to produce, I think, quite remarkable results that will meet the objectives we both seek. This has been going on, Mr. Broadbent.
But the gap's been widening, not narrowing. The gap between men and women since you've been Prime Minister in the public service has been widening, has been narrowing. So again, you say you have legislation there. That's right, it's been passed. But it, creates nice, you can run off a little list and say we passed this. But as we all know, you can have a law, but unless it's followed up by administrative action to bring fairness and equity, it means nothing.
Mr. Broadbent, I'm trying to explain to you that is precisely what we have done. This is being done by the Treasury Board as the representative of the employer and all of our public service unions to work out with the unions in a mutually satisfactory manner a program that will give rise to exactly this equity. We are budgeting for the funds required on an ongoing basis to make sure they are available so that this money will be given to those women who have been deprived of the degree of equity that we seek. That is exactly, Mr. Broadbent, what we've been trying to do.
What's about 4 years late? What about your commitment?
It's been going on for 4 years.
Well, the gap's been widening. You didn't answer the question. I said, while you've been Prime Minister, the gap between women and men has been widening, not narrowing. And you also promised to apply it to private companies, the same principle that deal with the federal government, as is in place in the United States. But you haven't done that.
Mr. Broadbent, Pat Carney, as president of Patricia Carney, as president of the Treasury Board, has been doing precisely this. This is what I've been trying to tell you. And that the money is being budgeted so that when the agreement is reached, it will be there to close that gap. It is not an easy thing. There are thousands of public service, tens of thousands of jobs that require identification and definition, and a proration of pay, and this takes time. But the commitment is there, the money is there, the legislation is there, and the administrative action taken, A, under Flora MacDonald's Employment Equity Act, and B, under Pat Carney and Roberta Cotres' administrative actions at Treasury Board, are going to bring about this I think, quite desirable result.
And why haven't you applied it to the private sector, as you said you would in 1984?
Well, we are beginning at home. We're getting our own shop in order, and we are beginning at home. We're a major employer. I think this would be, once it's done, an excellent model for the private sector. But first things first, I think we have to do it properly ourselves, and then see if how we can work it out with the private sector.
Thank you, gentlemen. We've now completed the second round and begin the third and final round of this encounter with Mr. Mulrooney and Mr. Turner. Pamela Wallen, your question, please.
I'd like to, I guess, stay on the topic for a while, at least of issues of interest to women, but I think it is much broader than that, and I want to bring it back to the free trade question. We've heard this evening about job creation for women and about the best social program being a job, but women feel particularly vulnerable under the free trade deal in industries like the service sector and in certain parts of the manufacturing industries as well, the manufacturing sectors. We've heard as well about the differences in rules that apply in the United States, which make it perhaps attractive for Canadian companies and for jobs in general to flow south as opposed to staying in Canada under this deal. Mr. Turner, and again the comments later from Mr. Mulrooney, if we could, what kind of specific rules could you envision to ensure that X number of jobs and jobs in which women are mostly vulnerable stay in this country under free trade if that arrangement goes ahead?
Well, the difficulty is that in most of the industries that are vulnerable under this trade agreement, textiles, electronic, services, women are the majority of employees, and therefore women are primarily vulnerable under the trade deal. And they know it. And I've said to Mr. Mulrooney, what is he going to do by way of adjustment program? He announced one in the House of Commons, and then the Minister of Finance contradicted him. I am saying that this whole trade deal, and we haven't had a chance, Madam Chair, to explore it as fully as I think we should have. This whole trade deal leaves us with a whole set of people, primarily women, who aren't going to protect it, but we get down to some fundamental questions. Why, and the Prime Minister hasn't answered this really in 5 hours of debate. He hasn't answered why he changed his own personal mind against a bilateral agreement with the United States. He hasn't answered why, when he didn't get secure access, as he admitted last night, he didn't get secure access into the American market, why he didn't pull out. He hasn't answered the question. He hasn't answered the question why he didn't ask for an exclusionary clause in the deal to ensure that when the definition of subsidy was being negotiated under the deal between Canada and the United States, social programs weren't excluded and regional economic equality programs weren't excluded. He hasn't answered these issues. And by allowing national treatment of Americans in Canada without any screening limits on investment, he has allowed Americans to capture our industry, capture the future of high tech and information in this country. Services industries is where it's all going to be at, and the Americans can't believe their good luck. No wonder the Senate of the United States passed this deal in one day. No wonder the House of Representatives passed it in one day. No wonder President Reagan said that this is the fulfillment of the American dream. We gave away our energy. We gave away our investment. We sold out our supply management and agriculture, and we've left hundreds of thousands of workers vulnerable, and women particularly vulnerable because of the social programs involved, because of the minimum wages that we'll have to start to compare and harmonize, because of the fact that they're in the vulnerable industries. And really, I think the time has come, after 5 hours of debate, for the Prime Minister to really answer those questions and tell us why he is where he is and why he didn't pull out when he didn't get what he thought he should have got.
I have answered, Mr. Turner, every conceivable question that has been put to me, both in English and French, directly, on national television, and I don't think I need any lessons from you, sir, about answering questions. If the question is put, I give my answer, and I'll let the panelists or the public decide. The question was put by Ms. Wallen in regard to the impact on women. I would ask that perhaps you set aside your opinion and set aside mine. This was the question that was asked. I'm entitled to comment on it, I gather, Madam Chairperson.
You are, Mr. Mulrooney.
Well, as Judith Maxwell, who is a woman, who is the chairperson of the Economic Council of Canada, she forecasts that there will be a creation of some 250,000 new jobs under the free trade agreement during its implementation period, and that there will be in these various sectors, particularly the service sector, brand new opportunities for women. She forecasts this as being a major new initiative that will benefit, among other people, women. Now, with regard to the question that Ms. Wallen raises, any impacts, and there will be, there are sectors where, and I think even the Economic Council of Canada spelled it out quite clearly, there are sectors where the impacts on employment will be negative. Well, in that case, we have employment adjustment programs now, but to be absolutely certain that we have done more than that, I asked a national commission chaired by one of Canada's most outstanding people, Jean de Grandpré of Montreal, to examine all of the adjustment requirements and to bring forward, particularly, for example, in regard to the effects that might exist upon women, and to bring forward any new programs that exist around the world or in North America or elsewhere that could be of benefit to us if required. We are anticipating his report. Although we do have a lot of adjustment programs now, clearly they could be improved upon. Although the forecasts are all positive in regard to employment prospects for free trade, it may very well be that Mr. de Grandpré's National Commission will come forward with some brand new ideas,
I
in which case I'd be happy to
I bet
entertain
the
them.
Prime Minister is relieved that Mr. de Grandpré hasn't come forward with this report so we can examine it. Because while the Economic Council of Canada continues to scale down its employment opportunities, now to 250,000 over 10 years, the Conference Board of Canada, also friends of the Prime Minister, have scaled it down to 125,000. His own former Minister of Employment, Benoit Bouchard, said there would be a loss of 500,000 jobs. The Economic Council of Canada sees 180,000 losses in jobs, most of whom are women. And here we are, frankly, the Prime Minister failing to come to grips with some programs that really would sponsor jobs, the infrastructure of this country, restoring our ability to combat pollution at the environmental level, at the municipal level, 314,000 jobs, our mayors say, and really, he has really done nothing concrete to help the women of this country on this deal.
Can I just say this, Mr. Turner? All of the forecasts that we have received from the Department of Finance or from the Economic Council or from any of the public policy institutes in Canada, any one that I have seen been made public, forecasts an increase in employment, new jobs, net new jobs under the free trade agreement, including jobs, as Judith Maxwell pointed out, to benefit women, for example, in the service sector. Now, you've indicated that I'd be relieved that Jean de Grandpré didn't present his report. On the contrary, I look forward to Mr. de Grandpré's report. He and his commissioners are people of uncommon reputation and ability, and I know they'll bring forward what will probably be a most helpful report, to not only to you and me as parliamentarians to help us in what we do in the House of Commons, but to Canadians generally. I would like us to be at the forefront of all problems of adaptation. If I may just say, there are 4 million Canadians today, right today, who on an annual basis change jobs. It's a phenomenon of a dynamic, growing economy.
Well, let's get back to the issue. I want to ask the Prime Minister whether he would take advantage of an invitation issued by Global to have a debate directly on trade so we can examine the employment possibilities, pro and con, so we can examine what's going to happen to our energy and becoming a continental reservoir of the United States, so that we can examine what's going to happen to the Canadian farmer, having to compete with a 12-month season in California, 12-month season in Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia with no protection. I want the Prime Minister to really say to me, look, we may differ on our views about the trade deal, but it is such a radical change in direction, and 70% of Canadians say they still don't understand it fully. Why don't you and I have a head-to-head, invite Mr. Broadbent, fine.
Isn't that nice? You would invite Mr. Broadbent?
Yes, I would indeed. Have a head-to-head, and let's deal with the issue the way Canadians expect us to deal with the issue.
We have been dealing with this issue, Mr. Turner, for 3 hours in one of our official languages last night, and for 3 hours in another of our official languages tonight. It seems to me you were very gracious to decide that you might include Mr. Broadbent. He'll be relieved to hear that.
Let's not get sarcastic. He has a perfect right to be there.
Well, of course he does. Yeah. We are in the process of completing tonight the 6-hour marathon debate on all aspects of all problems of our national life, including, obviously, the free trade agreement. I think that once this is done, we'll get back to our campaign. We'll discuss it with the Canadian people on a regular basis. I'm not declining any invitations at all. All I can do is tell you that our representatives met We agreed upon a quite unique and remarkable 6-hour format in both official languages. Surely you're not suggesting that we haven't debated these fully and fairly and adequately.
I think the Canadian people have a right to know why, when your primary objective was to get unfettered and secure access into the American market, we didn't get it. Why you didn't put clauses in to protect our social programs in this negotiation that we'll have on the definition of subsidies, where the heavy weight of the American Republic will be put in against us. Why did that not happen? Why also did we get a situation where we surrendered our entire energy policy to the United States, something they've been trying to achieve since 1956 under the Paley Commission? Why did we abandon our farmers? Why did we open our capital markets so that a Canadian bank can be bought up and we don't have reciprocal rights into the American market at all? Why did you remove any ability to control the Canadian ownership of our business? These are questions that Canadians deserve to have an answer to, and we have not had an opportunity in 6 hours to deal with them in a way that would make you come out of your shell.
Well, Mr. Turner, you're about 2 feet away from me. I've been with you for 6 hours. I've responded to everything that you had to say. I've responded openly to all questions by Canada's most distinguished journalists in English and French. There has been a most vigorous and I think probably unprecedented exchange of views. And yet, notwithstanding that, simply because you have an idea that only you have a proper interpretation of a given agreement, that it's difficult for anyone to persuade you of the opposite. And so, but you ought not to blame me or blame Mr. Broadbent for that or blame the journalists. There has been a very direct, as we're having now, and proper exchange of views. Now, if you would like further exchanges, you can ask your people at an appropriate time to meet with Global and others, and we'll see what can be worked out. But right now, rather than take up this time, I'll be happy to answer your questions.
I think the issues happen to be so important for the future of Canada. The issue of this election,
Mr. Turner, let me tell you something, sir. This country is only about 120 years old, but my own father, 55 years ago, went himself as a laborer with hundreds of other Canadians, and with their own hands in northeastern Quebec, they built a little town and schools and churches, and they, in their own way, were nation building. In the same way as the waves of immigrants from the Ukraine and Eastern Europe roll back the prairies, and in their own way, in their own time, they were nation building because they loved...
On to the next question from Doug Small, please.
I'd be quite happy to just let them keep right on rolling on that if they've got anything more to say.
They looked as if the issue had been exhausted. There are just 2 minutes left in this
Well, I don't know whether 2 minutes is enough to deal with it, but we might move to national sales taxes, your new one, Mr. Mulrooney. You say it will be revenue neutral. One of your own backbenchers says he doubts that. What guarantees can you give Canadians tonight that it won't be used to garner a windfall that, say, can finance some of your election spending promises? And while you're at it, how do you answer critics that this new tax would shift the tax burden away from income taxes, which are progressive, to consumption taxes, which aren't?
Well, the sales tax that we presently have is, I think, something we probably all agree upon, is a silent killer of jobs. It's a regressive tax that kills jobs and that kills productivity and kills our capacity for growth. And it's unfair and it's regressive. And so it has to be changed. In the national sales tax undertakings, and I'm aware of the comment that was made by a backbencher, but Mr. Wilson, the Minister of Finance, speaks for Canada, speaks for the government, and he clarified that matter completely.
Mr. Mulrooney, I'm going to ask you to
here's
just a second, Mr. Turner, to complete it quickly. I want Mr. Turner to have an opportunity.
Do I have a second?
Just a second.
All right. I just wanted to say that Mr. Wilson, in regard to the national sales tax, has been negotiating intensively with the provinces, the finance ministers. They appear to agree that this new national sales tax, would be beneficial as a replacement, but the sensitive negotiations are still ongoing, and that Mr. Wilson will report to Canada.
Thank you, Mr. Turner.
The reason is, of course, the Prime Minister doesn't want to tell Canadians what he has in mind. Don Blencarn, his chairman of the Finance Committee, said it's a $10 billion tax. That would amount to about a 16% tax across the country on everything that we buy. This Prime Minister, Mr. Mulrooney, promised with his Minister of Finance not to raise taxes. We have now a situation where the average family, $32,000 a year, pays $1,200 more in taxes. Somebody earning $100,000 or more a year pays $3,500 or less in taxes. Now we come in with the most regressive tax that one can imagine, and there is no frankness on the part of the Prime Minister that he's going to tell us what he has in mind.
Thank you, gentlemen. This encounter is now over. Thank you very much. And Mr. Turner and Mr. Broadbent now have the floor. The next question is from David Halton.
Mr. Broadbent, we heard you earlier this evening accusing the other two leaders of inconsistency, of bending with the wind. You seem to be backtracking pretty fast on your own party's long-standing commitment to pull Canada out of NATO. First, you said that you wouldn't go ahead with that withdrawal in the first term of an NDP government. Now we hear you saying that you wouldn't go ahead with it if it would in any way destabilize East-West relations. Where's the consistency here?
Well, I don't have any trouble with that. I mean, the total consistency, the policy of the party is exactly as you've described it. There's been no backing away from it. Why
are you putting it off?
Why are we putting it off? Because it would be destabilizing to announce a precise date. Neither Mr. Reagan nor Mr. Gorbachev would announce a major move in terms of the distribution of power on either side of the alliance and give a precise date without some kind of counter response, without some kind of indication that this would not be destabilizing. It would be childish, it would be blunt idiocy to do such a thing. I happen to have talked to Mr. Gorbachev and talked to them very directly about the need for the Soviet Union to open the country up to on-site inspection. I've talked to the principal American negotiator in the disarmament talks, the principal Soviet negotiator. I've had some experience in this field, and I know that this country of ours, that played an early role in formulating NATO originally, that my party supported, now we're saying, we're moving into the 1990s. This isn't the 1950s. The superpowers are taking us in a direction of disarmament. I want us to be part of that. We have said as a party that we wouldn't go for this lunacy of buying nuclear submarines, especially when the superpowers are going in the other direction. We have also said, yes, that's the goal, to be out of NATO. But it has every kind of logical consistency in terms of a nation that wants to move in a peaceful direction. The people who first advocated NATO didn't ever envisage that we would be in there for our life, that it became the cornerstone of foreign policy. Membership in NATO is a means to an end. And so what we're saying is now move our troops out of Europe. I'm glad to take this opportunity. Mr. Turner launched into a great digression on this half an hour ago. We're saying European countries now, unlike the late 40s and early 50s when NATO was first proposed, many of them have a per capita income higher than ours, not lower. They have a military capacity greater than ours, not inferior now. They can, thank you very well, look after the troops situation in Europe. I can't imagine the French sending troops over to protect our Arctic, station them here on a permanent basis. I can't understand why we're still positioning troops there. If you permit, you just Mr. Turner.
Please.
And so what we're saying is come back here, bring our forces out of there, create, I say to Mr. Turner, who was off on a bizarre tangent on this before, we're not against all alliances, Mr. Turner. We've talked about the United States, for example, of wanting to reconstitute an alliance that the Liberals, by the way, signed, they made a change in the NORAD agreement that permitted acceptance ultimately of a Star Wars project, which Mr. Turner himself at one time accepted, but he's changed his mind, I understand. We wanted a change in agreement in NORAD and a defense agreement with the United States as a North American country that would give us Canadian control over our territory. So we are not talking about putting our heads in the sand or some kind of neutralism. We're talking about a responsible democratic country that looks to the future instead of the past, that has a credible defense policy, that wants to be consistent with our traditional democratic allies. But like as in social policy and other areas, the NDP likes to think ahead instead of in the past. Now, if Mr. Turner wants to reply, I suspect he will. I welcome it.
I'd like to reply because I think, Mr. Broadbent, you're fudging.
Oh, what am I fudging at?
You have got a firm policy position set by your party at an open convention to withdraw from our alliances in Europe and with the United States.
I just said that.
Now, fine.
NATO.
But
where's the fudging?
Then you don't explain how it is that you would then calculate our defense expenditures if we had to do it alone. And I say that the budget would be horrendous in the area of $100 billion. You haven't said how Canada would be able to pursue its arms control objectives and its disarmament objectives without being part of NATO. You haven't said how this would affect Canada's relationship with the United States if we were to breach that relationship. You have given us no precision on your policy on defense at all, on defense spending at all, and so far, until tonight, you've got a fairly free ride, and I think it's up to Canadians to judge, when they're evaluating the political parties, where the New Democratic Party would take us in terms of our firm commitments in defense and with our allies.
Mr. Turner, I couldn't agree more. And as the leader of a party that hasn't had a defense policy review in 20 years, which is your party, you've never done anything in 20 years. Your party, in fact, was involved in so many contradictory military policies, it's impossible to list them all, including your own flip-flop on the Star Wars issue.
There was no flip-flop on the Star Wars issue.
We have been very consistent. I repeat to you again, please note it, that we want an agreement with the United States for the defense of Canada, but unlike your party, we are prepared to say the Canadian part of that should be under Canadian control. We want to continue good working relationships, but we don't see ourselves as a subordinate to the United States or to Western Europe. We have certain pride in our accomplishments, and it's a clear position. It looks to the future.
Well, it
doesn't surprise me that you don't like change.
Let me cite a member of your caucus. The NDP has backpedaled on this issue by declaring, apparently, that the NDP wouldn't withdraw immediately, it would consult.
Where's the backpedaling? I don't understand that.
But that result is not consistent with your policy position. Canadians demand and deserve a better answer to this, and even your member of Parliament, Sven Robinson from Vancouver, now from Burnaby, commented sarcastically on your change of position and said that the move was, quote, a triumph of political expediency over principle.
Well,
now, I happen to agree on that issue with your member of Parliament.
Mr. Turner, every now and then I really do think you try to be fair. And now, will you tell me where the policy's changed? Give me the change in the policy. One thing I want to be clear with you. I went into political life to be totally honest with my commitments, including the commitments of my party policy. My party policy does say, in the long run, yes, we should be independent of the alliance. That's my view. There has been no watering down, but Mr. Turner, I repeat, I've talked to Mr. Gorbachev directly about having on-site inspection in the Soviet Union. I've talked to both the American and Soviet negotiators, I said just a minute ago. I have some experience. I don't want to exaggerate
your party policy is
Will you tell me where it's changed?
Your party policy
just made the
is quite categorical.
Yes.
And you're fudging on it.
Where am I fudging on it?
You're trying to soften that position.
Where am I fudging
so that Canadians look upon you as a more moderate party. And that is not so.
You're indulging in cliches, Mr.
I am not.
I've reasserted our commitment.
I am trying to tie you to your party policy, and you refuse to say, as leader of the party, whether you're bound by that policy or not.
I just said it.
All right.
You heard me? You heard me? I mean, it shouldn't be a problem. I've said that's our policy. I've never said anything other than that. And if you have trouble with that, that's your problem.
No, now I know where we stand.
Thank you. Pamela Wallen, your question, please.
Mr. Turner, you've been pointing out quite strongly that Mr. Broadbent, in your view, is having trouble reconciling his party's policy with his leadership platform in this campaign. The critics say that that's in fact your problem too, that you're having a tough time reconciling some of your party's policies with your own members of the party. If you can't begin to reconcile those problems internally in your own party, and I won't go through the list now, how can you start to deal with and larger issues on a national front? How can you lead the country?
I tell you, when I assumed the leadership of the Liberal Party, I returned the party to its members. I made it the most democratic, open political institution in this country. And I would prefer to lead an open, democratic party with all the risks that that entails, with all the open discussion, because we don't hide our debates on Meech Lake, we don't hide them on trade, we don't hide them on abortion, we deal up front. I would prefer that position to a position of a prime minister who has presided over a government for 4 years, riven by scandal, riven by ministerial resignations, riven by conflict of interest problems, and interrupted quite frequently by police investigations. I would rather have my position, too, than the leader of the New Democratic Party standing opposite me, who, bound by policy resolutions on defense, neutralist, withdrawing from NATO, bound by policy resolutions on nationalizing a bank, bound by policy resolutions of nationalizing 50% of our resource industry, continually skates around and hides his real agenda from the Canadian people. And we have not had from the New Democratic Party the kind of open debate, the kind of frank policy resolutions that we would expect. I haven't really been apprised of a new imaginative idea from Mr. Broadbent's party because he's trying desperately to hide his true colors.
Have I got a secret agenda?
Hiding his true colors in order to gain political opportunistic value.
Mr. Broadbent.
Mr. Turner, if I be frank, you're relying on notes there, some kind of silly cliche argument. Let's deal with
the
your...
only notes I have here is the quote of Sven Robinson.
Let me talk about where we're hiding from policy. You say that public ownership is somehow a radical idea. I remind you, sir, that it was your party, with our support, that brought petroleum into the public sector with Petro-Canada. We have in this country, the CBC, the CNR. We have two banks. Can I point this out already? In the province of Ontario, we have a public sector bank. In Alberta, we have a public sector bank. Most of the countries in Western Europe already, a long time ago, and you were a former Minister of Finance, you should know that, have now public sector banks. I don't think that's a particularly radical idea. We have a mixed economy. Public participation is quite normal. I'm surprised to hear a man who describes himself as progressive. You find this so heretical. We don't back away from it. It's a question of timing on so many policies, serious objectives. We want to act on the environment. We want to spend money on it. We want to act on child care. We think that's a much more important priority. You had the responsibility, for example. You talked about us. I have no hidden agenda, and I repeat that. We're going to spell out everything we plan to do. We don't back away from things.
Are you bound by those party resolutions?
You, in contrast,
Mr. Turner, you will have an opportunity
you
to
in contrast, come along here. You were Prime Minister 4 years ago. You're now publicly advocating so many things that you had a chance in the cabinet, when Prime Minister, you didn't touch. Whether it's your sewage treatment policy now, which you turned down, whether it's other environmental action.
Let's be fair and accurate.
Whether it's pay equity, when you were there, your party did nothing. You name the whole range. You put more tax loopholes in there for upper income Canadians than all other finance ministers put together. Now you are talking about tax reform. And what about your 29... I have to ask a question. You're going to spend $29 billion. Where are you going to get the money? Where are you getting the money?
There were rules that the time limits would be respected. I know it's difficult.
Mr. Broadbent, is really playing with the facts. I was Prime Minister for 2 months, and most of it taken up in the general election. When I was in government as Minister of Finance, I also indexed the old age pension to protect our senior citizens from the ravages of inflation. I set up the registered homeownership plan to encourage young men and women to purchase a first home. I indexed the family allowance system to protect young families who are trying to bring up children. So don't feel that you've got any monopoly on good ideas, Mr. Broadbent, or on a good conscience. I'm just saying to you that the infrastructure program, the environmental program that I responded to 3 years ago with the Canadian mayors and municipalities in Hamilton in 1986 was the same kind of program that Walter Gordon, when I was with him, presented under Municipal Works in 1964. We've had a strong tradition.
But why'd you say no to it in 1984 when you were Prime Minister? They asked you then, and you said no.
Come on. I inherited a government, had to get in possession of the dossiers. I'm just saying to you that, we have had a new direction in the last 4 years. We've got a very complete policy program. I'm just saying to you, why don't you complain with some of these issues I've described and say to Canadians, frankly, whether you stand by those party resolutions that you're trying to hide.
I think the people of Canada know I'm straightforward. I don't have problems on that, and I've always been, and I always will be straightforward. There's no hidden agendas, and I think it's rather petty of you to suggest that there is, frankly.
Thank you. There's a few minutes left, and the next question will be from Doug Small.
Well, since we only have a few minutes, Mr. Broadbent, during the campaign you've been advocating a two-party system. After listening to the two of you, Canadians may now have a better understanding why. But the question I'd like to ask is, if we ever got there, That would deprive Canadians of the option of minority governments, which you've often embraced and exploited to advantage for people in the past. So why this new emphasis on a two-party system when you've, like this old one?
The emphasis I had was
Gentlemen, just to warn you, there
sorry.
would only be 45 seconds for each answer.
The emphasis I had was on clear choices for Canadians. And what I wanted is, on the one hand, we have Mr. Mulroney in the Conservative Party on free trade, on taxes, on regional development, has very different positions from ours. We have a clear, consistent option that we've had for a number of years, and it seemed to me that if Canadians are really looking for a fair, reasonable alternative to the Conservatives, it's the New Democratic Party. Certainly not the party of confusion, that the Liberal Party that takes contradictory positions every day of the week on every given issue. And it was in that sense I thought it was desirable to have a clear option, a clear choice that would be available to the people of Canada.
Thank you.
I think Canadians have always supported broadly based progressive parties. The Liberal Party has been the overwhelming choice for most of this century. I want to ask Mr. Broadbent if he really believes he wants to reduce the system to a two-party system. When he finishes third in this election, will he disband the New Democratic Party?
Mr. Turner, you're in third place, sir, not me. Your party is running third, so I think it's more likely that you will be facing that question.
Well, we'll see, but I'll look forward to your fulfilling that commitment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Turner, Mr. Broadbent. The final exchange will be between Mr. Mulroney and Mr. Broadbent. And the first question will be from David Halton.
Mr. Mulroney, interest rates are on the way up again. That may be helping to check inflation in Ontario, but it's certainly causing a lot of harm to the rest of the country. I'd like you to explain why you're backing this policy, why you've allowed interest rates to inch up to pretty much the same level as 84, and then to turn to Mr. Broadbent and ask whether he's still sticking to his policy of forcing the Bank of Canada to get those interest rates down, and whether, if necessary, you'd have to fire the governor of the bank.
Well, the interest rates are about 1.75 points below 84, and the reason they have been inching up is because Governor Crow, supported by the government, Mr. Wilson and the government, believes that, quite properly, that growth, economic growth, must be maintained in a non-inflationary climate. Inflation, once it begins, is too late to stop. You've got to keep it under control while it is there. This is why interest rates have crept up. I recognize that part of the reason is the tremendous growth that has been going on in central Canada, and some of the more far-flung regions suffer as a result. But I think we have to remember that inflation has been kept at about 4%, and we've had remarkable economic growth, and this is the first time that inflation has been maintained at these levels since about 1971. And so the desired objective of sustained economic growth in a non-inflationary climate requires a great deal of vigilance on the part of the governor of the bank, who doesn't have an easy job. This is a tough and delicate call that he has to make. The economy remains strong and powerful. The free trade agreement that has been signed is sending off very positive signals of investment and confidence around the world. Our growth is going to continue strong. Our job creation is going to continue strong, and that has brought about some tensions in respect of inflation in certain pressures in certain areas of Canada. My hope is that we will be able to equalize opportunities much more, and that it will lessen the pressures of inflation, and therefore the pressure on the dollar. That having been said, the Governor of the Bank of Canada, of course, retains our full confidence, and will continue to do so.
Thank you. Mr. Broadbent?
Yes, our policy is that the government is making a mistake in having high interest policies for the country as a whole. The Prime Minister is right. There has been the re-emergence of some inflation in central Canada, more precisely in metropolitan Toronto. Our view is, though, you shouldn't impose an interest rate policy, a high interest rate policy, on all of Canada to deal with the problems of metropolitan Toronto. And all the premiers, without exception, to my knowledge, a few months ago, called upon the Government of Canada to move with the Bank of Canada to bring down interest rates. And I think it makes sense. And to deal with the inflation problem in Toronto, I think, if I can put it this way, I think the government has the cart before the horse. The major reason for inflation in Toronto has been the booming nature of the Ontario economy, which caused people to move there because they couldn't get jobs elsewhere. Put pressure on housing. Housing prices have really gone up. I think the government should have moved decisively to deal with the housing crisis in Toronto, which would have nipped the inflationary pressures in the bud, and kept a lower interest rate policy in place for the rest of the country that is not fully out of the recession yet, in the prairies, in the interior of British Columbia, Atlantic Canada, regions of Quebec. So instead of imposing a Toronto high interest rate policy in the whole country, I think we should have interest rates down about a percentage point. And to get back to your question, Mr. Halton, about the governor of the Bank of Canada, of course, you don't do it on a day-to-day basis in running the Bank of Canada. But as we saw in the coin affair, we've changed governors of the Bank of Canada. If the governor doesn't make on a consistent major policy like interest rates, decisions that are consistent with government policy, of course at some point he would have to go. And in the sense of integrity, he would have to go. So an NDP government that says now, yes, we should be bringing down interest rates, if after a chat with the governor of the Bank of Canada, he didn't see over some reasonable period of time that he started moving in that direction, and if he disagreed with that policy, in good faith, I would expect him to leave the job.
Mr. Mulroney, any reply?
Well, I can tell you that if you did that, there would be an impact on the dollar and interest rates and investment overnight that would impact immediately on job creation and have a most negative impact on economic growth in Canada.
If he did what?
If we did exactly what you're implying.
Well, that's what all the premiers wanted.
Well, whether the
you quote them in other instances,
well,
say all the premiers wanted lower
As Prime Minister, I'm responsible for a national monetary policy. I understand that a given premier at a given time would like interest rates lower or higher if you're depending on the commodities that you're trying to export. I understand that, but we can't have two monetary policies.
No,
we can only have one.
Right.
And I think there will only be one, and the governor of the Bank of Canada will set that policy, given the confidence that we have in his expertise. This having been said, I think it's simplistic to suggest that and to blame metropolitan Toronto. Toronto's
I didn't blame Toronto.
But the growth has been so remarkable in central Canada, not just Toronto. It's been from the Triangle all the way into Montreal. Montreal is experiencing a remarkable comeback. 175,000 jobs created in Montreal, for example, in the last 4 years, which really is a record. And so there are strong inflationary pressures beginning throughout central Canada, where the mass of our population lives, and it is very important. We see that, for example, in wage settlements. We see it in all kinds of areas beginning. It's important that the governor of the Bank of Canada exercise vigilance and good judgment in terms of interest rates. It is important they come down. The way you ensure they come down is make sure that your deficit goes down and that you keep driving that deficit down so you can restore some sanity to the financial apparatus of the government of Canada. That inspires confidence. That'll drive interest rates down.
Thank you. Pamela Wallen?
The issue is the environment. Both of you support environmental assessments of federally funded or federally sanctioned projects. A couple of quick points. Would they be binding, those assessments? In other words, would you cancel politically popular projects like Hibernia or the oil sands if it was found that these projects were environmentally dangerous? And would you carry that a step further, prosecuting American companies that get involved in environmentally dangerous activities like creating acid rain?
We have said that in terms of not only the mega projects that you have mentioned, Pamela, but all such major economic decisions, consistent with the Brundtland report, which Mr. Mulroney's government has given lip service to, we should have a major environmental assessment done with every project. And that before it's finally approved, it should be looked at. And I think that we're finally on a global basis moving towards that. But if I may add on other environmental matters, we are concerned about the environment, and Mr. Mulroney's government, again, on every aspect of the environment virtually, has said one thing and done another. For Mr. Mulroney in 1984, it was again, I'm quoting him, first priority. Then right after he formed the government, there were hundreds laid off in the Environment Department. He produced an environmental bill, so-called Environmental Protection Act in June, that every interest group in the country that's interested in the environment has said has no teeth, will be ineffective, and they were right. Mr. Mulroney suddenly discovered the environment after there was a very regrettable accident involving PCBs at Saint-Basile-le-Grand. But it didn't lead to the government bringing forward legislation that has teeth in it, didn't lead to it doing what West Germany's done, what Japan's done, Switzerland has done, 10 states in the United States, putting environmental matters in the criminal code. Long overdue, but you will see Mr. Mulroney in this campaign again talking about the environment, as he did in the last, but doing virtually nothing about it.
Mr. Mulroney.
Well, just very quickly. The reason we didn't put environmental matters in the criminal code is that if you put it in the criminal code, it benefits the polluters, because the polluter is then under the requirements of the criminal code, which give him the benefit of the doubt, whereas under our system, the way we have done it, we can act properly and vigorously. Again, once the act of pollution has been committed, guilt is established. And so this is in the public interest that we didn't proceed that way.
Mr. Mulroney, I think if people went to jail for criminal offenses, just as they can go to jail if they steal your property or steal your car, if we did it tough like other countries have, then an executive that has to make up his mind, is he going to put a toxic substance in something he's producing? If he knows, if he makes that decision that could do harm to our lakes, to our health, he could go to jail under the criminal code. I say to you, that would be effective, as other countries have done.
If he does it, I can tell you right now he's going to jail.
Well, he can go with a criminal offense.
Absolutely. He can
go with a criminal offense, and he'll have a criminal record.
It remains an indictable offense, and he conserves under the Environment Act a criminal record. Absolutely, we can do it. What it spares us is the burden that is required under the criminal code. Now, with regard to the question that was asked by Ms. Wallen in regard to sustainable development, our answer is in the affirmative to her question. That these mega projects, for example, must be developed in harmony with the environment. They must meet the very strict environmental standards that are promulgated. Otherwise, the development will not proceed. This is the concept of sustainable development that was enunciated and articulated by Prime Minister Brundtland in her capacity as chairperson of the United Nations Commission on the World and Changing Environment. And we subscribe to that view. I spoke to the United Nations in regard to it. We've established the first international center at Winnipeg. And I know that my honorable friend is quite ready to criticize us. He doesn't often give us much credit. But it's interesting that Prime Minister Brundtland did. And she is recognized as the most outstanding person, perhaps, on the environment internationally. And she, some months ago, said, textually just about, I want to congratulate the Prime Minister and the Government of Canada for their leadership, the leadership they are providing the industrialized countries in respect of the environment. The fact of the matter, Mr. Broadbent, is that we have done a lot. We haven't done enough. And perhaps we were a little late as a country and as a society in doing all of the things that we should have done and should be doing for the environment. But we are playing catch-up in a very serious and, I think, effective way. 6 national parks.
Mr. Mulroney, I'm going to ask you to wind up now, please, so I can give Mr. Broadbent an opportunity to reply. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Broadbent?
Well, Mr. Mulroney, you've just done it again. You've said that you, and I want to be fair to the argument, you just said that you're now making environmental assessments as a standard part of your governmental decision-making process. You do it, you said, with the mega projects and so on. Well, the reality is, about a month ago, your government announced a decision about a river diversion project affecting Manitoba and Saskatchewan, that there was no environmental study done by the federal government in advance at all. It led to a senior advisor in the Minister of the Environment's department resigning because she said your government was playing politics on the issue. So here again, you go before the people of Canada and you tell them, yes, you're going to do all these things, but when you made a major decision affecting the environment in the context of an election campaign, you made a deal, as she said, with the governments of Saskatchewan that violated all environmental concerns. Why didn't, I ask you, why didn't you have your government do an environmental assessment of that decision before you approved of it?
Mr. Broadbent,
very briefly, Mr. Mulroney, I want to move on to one last issue.
Well, yes, if I may. Why would you necessarily accept the view of Miss May, who was the critic in this regard, rather than the statement of the Minister of the Environment, Tom McMillan, in the House of Commons, where he clearly stated the government's position that all of the environmental safeguards were met, that it was an entirely legitimate environmental
you
decision.
did no study. He didn't say the federal government did a
Gentlemen,
study.
I'm going to interrupt. I'm going to move on to one last issue with Doug Small, please.
Mr. Mulrooney, Mr. Broadbent, there are so many questions that we have left that we'd like to ask, but I'm going to go, I think, to one that's bedeviled the country since the beginning of time. The Lubicon affair in Alberta has driven home again the continuing dilemma over native land and self-government claims. Do you support the deal that Premier Getty and the Lubicons have reached, and would either of you move early after the election on November 21st on a new constitutional round with natives in this country? If you would, how soon?
Mr. Mulrooney, before you answer, just let me advise both of you that there's only 3 minutes left, and I want to be sure that the time limits are kept. Thank you, Mr. Mulrooney.
May I begin?
Yes, please.
All right. Well, I'm very happy with the settlement that was reached by the Premier in regard to the Lubicon. As you know, I've just come back from the Northwest Territories a few weeks ago, where we reached a major land claim settlement with the Dene Métis in the Northwest Territories. I think that my view on it is best expressed by the tremendous amount of effort that we put into as Prime Minister, that I put into it, and along with everybody, in trying to reach a constitutional amendment that favored the Aboriginal peoples. I can say it because I think it was the kind of initiative that received the support from all parties in the House of Commons. And we came this close in 85 and 86, this close to a constitutional amendment which would have brought about historic fairness and a resolution, I believe, of a problem that, as you say, has bedeviled Canada since its foundation. It deals with justice for our Aboriginal peoples. It goes to the root of the problem, and we came this close. And it's interesting to note that one of the reasons I believe we failed in that exercise is because one of the provinces, Quebec, was not a member of the constitutional process. Quebec would have supported
Mr. Mulrooney.
at that point in time.
I'm going to turn to Mr. Broadbent.
2 points. First, on the Lubicon, I compliment, of course, the Lubicon people themselves, who have been so patient for decades in negotiating and finally getting an agreement that was acceptable to them, and I think to Mr. Getty deserves some credit, finally, of coming together. However, as the Prime Minister knows, there's a major involvement of the federal government. The whole question of division of resources, potentially energy resources, has to be settled by the federal government in discussions with the Lubicon, and I sent a telegram to the Prime Minister urging that he ask his minister, Mr. McKnight, to get involved with that, and so that the second step, the federal step, will be taken immediately following the settlement with the provincial government in Alberta. On the question of Aboriginal rights beyond that, one of the amendments that we moved to the Meech Lake Accord that I deeply regretted was not there in the first place is a commitment that all the First Ministers would have is an early conference with Aboriginal Canadians to settle the issue of Aboriginal self-government. We have a commitment to have a conference on fish, incredibly in that agreement, but none at all to meet the legitimate needs of the first people of this great country of ours.
Very brief reply, Mr. Mulrooney.
Well, the matter of Aboriginal rights is one. I don't think that Canada will be complete as a nation until that matter is effectively resolved.
Thank you very much. Gentlemen, we have now completed the 3 rounds of debate. Each leader will now have up to 3 minutes for closing remarks. First, Mr. Mulrooney.
Ladies and gentlemen, what you have heard tonight points up the important differences between the government and the opposition parties. On free trade and tax reform and child care and regional development, our international commitments, they by and large are opposed to most of what we stand for. And yet, as you've noticed, they have very little plans of their own. Their alternatives strike me as being essentially negative. They would leave Canada standing frozen in the headlights of progress as the world passes us by. Tonight, and throughout the election campaign, I have been speaking about some of the major initiatives of our government. Let me try to put our program into perspective for you by explaining why we are doing some of these things. Canada can and does excel, given the opportunity to do so. That is why we stand for an expansionary trade policy, founded on free trade with the biggest market in the world. Second, more trade means more jobs. and a strong economy is the guarantee of a distinctly Canadian program in health care, education, social services, and environment. It's the new pool of wealth that's going to enable us to do more for the elderly and the disabled and those who need our assistance. Continued economic growth lets us ensure literacy and training and affirmative action programs so that every Canadian has a fair chance at a good job and a share of our national prosperity. A child care program, generous enough to double current facilities and yet flexible enough to allow you to decide how best to look after your own children. To make the most of our commitment, we need a renewed commitment to education in science and technology and research and development, and as we have been talking about, environmental excellence. We have confidence in Canada. The human values of caring and compassion and respect will be enlarged, not weakened, in the stronger Canada we will build together. We don't intend to shelter those values, but to proclaim them as the essence of our Canadianism, as our richest asset, as the most enduring contribution we can make to mankind. That is the Canada of our vision. These are the choices we offer. The election is about choices. It's about challenges, and it's about change. It's about which party and which leader is competent in your judgment to manage the economy and direct federal-provincial relations and conduct foreign policy. It's about which team of men and women is best able to lead this country into the 1990s. It's about an agenda for our country and a vision of Canada in a new decade and a new century. We offer too, I believe and I hope, a team of men and women to carry forward that vision, to turn those choices into action. I believe that our progressive conservative candidates across Canada are the finest ever presented, I believe, in a national election. I ask for your hand, and I ask for your help. And I believe together we can build a Canada that is more united, more tolerant, and more prosperous.
Thank you, Mr. Mulroney. Mr. Turner?
Thank you, Madam Chair, for having presided this debate. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight I have told you the kind of Canada I believe in, the values I will bring to government, the choices I will make as Prime Minister. The NDP have made their choice. They want big government to run everything. Mr. Mulroney has made his choice. He wants us to be completely dependent on the United States. He wants them to decide what is best for us. Never in my life has there been an issue on which I have felt so strongly. Mr. Mulroney calls it free trade. But thanks to liberal governments, 80% of everything we already sell to the United States goes across that border free. It is free trade. To get the other 20%, Mr. Mulroney negotiated away our ability to control our own economy and, in fact, our own future. Our energy is important to us. Under Mr. Mulroney's deal, we will become a continental reservoir for the United States. The Americans will now be deciding how we use our resources, including our water. Under this deal, any Canadian company worth up to $150 million can be taken over, and we can't say a thing about it. Under this deal, our farmers will be at the mercy of American farmers who have a 12-month growing season compared to our shorter season. Even worse, he has agreed to let the Americans have a say in the future of our social programs like unemployment insurance and Medicare, in our regional equality programs, like the support we give our fishermen and farmers. There is virtually no area of Canadian life that has been left untouched. I believe in this country. I have faith in Canada. I don't believe my feelings are any different from yours. We have something special here, something we don't want to lose. We have a way of life, a way of looking at ourselves, a way of reacting to the world. Mr. Mulroney's trade deal will change all that. It will make us little more than a junior partner of the United States. I believe in a strong, sovereign, independent Canada. I believe that we are now talented enough and confident enough and tough enough to make our own choices for our own future in our own way. I need your support on November 21st. You and I must not allow Mr. Mulroney to sell us out, to reverse 120 years of Canadian history, to destroy the Canadian dream. Thank you and good night.
Thank you, Mr. Turner. Finally, we'll hear from Mr. Broadbent.
Thank you, Madam Chairperson. Well, people of Canada now have heard the three leaders to talk about our priorities, our concerns, our hopes, our aspirations. You have heard Mr. Mulroney try to justify what has been, by and large, a very disappointing performance for 4 years, whether it's on the environment, whether it's on women's issues, whether it's on a fair tax system, whether it's on the very fate of our nation in terms of this comprehensive deal that he has negotiated with the Americans. On the other hand, you have heard Mr. Turner saying a lot of things now that when he had the chance as Prime Minister or part of a Liberal government, he was taking completely opposite positions, whether it's on taxation, whether it's on the environment, whether it's on regional development. Mr. Turner, as leader of the Liberal Party, is saying and doing one thing now quite different from what his own past experience as a member of the Cabinet had at that time. They both had a chance. I am now saying it's time for a change. It's time for people who will make choices. I don't have difficulty deciding when I have to make a decision between the environment and polluters. It doesn't bother me to decide in the tax system whether the average family should get preference over the rich. I know whose side I'm on. It doesn't concern me to work to change this country of ours so my daughter will have the same chances in growing up as my son. These are basic questions, and what I'm asking you to decide is this. Is it now the time to continue with the old ways of parties that say one thing before an election and do something after? Or is it time to change? Is it finally time to put as a priority, which is my political faith, fairness for the average family? That should be the guiding light, and that we say the same thing before an election and we do it after. My party's not perfect. We don't preach perfection, but what we do say is fairness for the average Canadian ought to be at the front burner of the political agenda. I promise you to work day in, day out, week in and week out for the average family in this country. It's time that the average person really counted. That's what I'm all about. I need your support from coast to coast, and I hope we'll get it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Broadbent. Gentlemen, our time is up. I thank and commend you for your cooperation and stamina in what has been a very energetic evening. To the journalists, I thank you for your effective questions, and to all of you, I thank you for your historic contribution to the democratic process. I know at times the evening has been difficult, but I think everyone did their best to conform to the agreement. I want finally to thank the audience, all of you, for watching, and hope that the exercise has been a useful one and an informative one. Thank you very much for keeping us company this evening. Good night.
Now, back here on Parliament Hill, here in the nation's capital, I'm Peter Mansbridge. It's been a remarkable last 2 nights here, 3 hours last night in French and 3 hours again tonight in Ottawa. It's not my role, far from it, to try to predict a winner in the debates of the last 2 nights, but we want you to stay with us in just a couple of minutes coming up from now We'll have full coverage of the debates here on the National. So stay with us. We'll be back in a couple of minutes. I'm Peter Mansbridge in Ottawa.
From physics, astronomy, and biology come dramatic new insights into evolution. Is there an unbroken pathway from the formless energy of the Big Bang to life on Earth? Natural Connections, Wednesday on the Nature of Things with David Suzuki, 8 o'clock, 9:30 in Newfoundland.
Don't miss the season premiere
Where's my son?
of Dallas.
Not want me to come after her.
The wait is finally over. Friday. The National, followed by The Journal, next on CBC Television. 1957, the King rocked the world. The Buick Roadmaster was every man's dream, and Paul Cromer opened a radio sales and repair shop in Toronto. Those days are gone, but 3 generations of Torontonians still make Cromer Radio their choice for state-of-the-art home audio systems, car radio, and brand-name television and video equipment. Today, Cromer still stands for quality and service, and above all, value. For over 30 years, Cromer Radio, 420 Bathurst, south of College.
Being a duke is not what it used to be. Opened the house to tourists. Good morning. Sold the family silver. Auctioned the 17th duke. Fact is, nearly everything's gone, except the old family favorite, Schweppes tonic. Essence of fresh fruit. Cheeky little bubbles. Schwepperwesen.
Oh, thank you very much, Your Lordship.
My pleasure.
Schweppes, the great British bubbly.
An interview with Ed Broadbent tomorrow night on the CBC at 6.
Tuesday, October 25th. Tonight on The National, once more in English, the leaders go at each other in the election debates. Gassing the crowds, protests against segregated elections in South Africa are broken up. And on The Journal, facing the music, the satirical spotlights on tonight's primetime political performers. The National with Peter Mansbridge.
Good evening from Parliament Hill in Ottawa. Well, it was quite a night. They fired away at close range tonight, hoping to get their shots in while dodging the ones aimed their way. The weapons were words. For the second night in a row, Brian Mulroney, John Turner, and Ed Broadbent hammered away at each other in a television debate. Last night's was in French, widely seen as a good night for John Turner. Tonight's was in English. At times, there was quiet and careful discussion of the issues. At other times, there was the crackle of confrontation. We have a number of reports, but first, the sharpest set-to came in the last hour of the debate. Mulroney and Turner in a clash over free trade, the central issue of this election. It was a clash that almost turned into a shouting match. Don Newman, the CBC senior parliamentary editor, is across the street in our Ottawa bureau. Don, I certainly wouldn't want to predict a winner on that exchange, but aside from the smoke and fire, what did it accomplish?
Well, it certainly was the exchange on the issue, Peter, full of emotion rather than fact, which is probably the way most Canadians will end up deciding how to vote on free trade anyway. What it accomplished for John Turner was it got him back in the game. As you pointed out earlier, last night seemed to be Turner's night, but today he'd been performing very poorly until he got to that exchange. The interesting thing is that Mulroney kind of led him into it. The Prime Minister was cruising along on free trade. Suddenly John Turner jumped in demanding another debate on free trade. They ended up arguing about what their parents and grandparents had done, and the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition were standing toe-to-toe, waving fingers at each other. Really a big exchange that got John Turner back into the game in a debate that he hadn't been doing very well in.
All right, stand by, Don, because we've got another one now, because there was also quite a moment between Broadbent and Turner in the final hour. The polls say they're fighting for second place, and both men spent time tonight telling voters how they differ. At one point, they got to talking about defense. Turner made an accusation. Broadbent reacted with indignation. Here it is.
Canadians demand and deserve a better answer to this, and even your Member of Parliament, Sven Robinson from Vancouver, now from Burnaby, commented sarcastically on your change of position and said that the move was, quote, a triumph of political expediency over principle. Well, now, I happen to agree on that issue with your Member of Parliament.
Mr. Turner, every now and then, I really do think you try to be fair. And now, will you tell me where the policy's changed? Give me the change in the policy. One thing I want to be clear with you. I went into political life to be totally honest with my commitments, including the commitments of my party policy. My party policy does say, in the long run, yes, we should be independent of the alliance.
All right, Don, the polls at least indicate that these two men are in a race for second place, and you saw it through that confrontation, but also in other parts tonight.
Well, you're absolutely right, and for most of the evening, Ed Broadbent performed very well, much better than he had in French, I guess illustrating that the language problem was a big one for him last night. But one of the things the Liberals wanted to do was portray the NDP as a radical party, one with a radical defense policy. They wanted to discuss the NATO pullout, or the alleged NATO pullout, as Mr. Turner was making it tonight, of the NDP. And in the last hour again, Mr. Turner seemed to screw up his courage and go after both Mulrooney and Broadbent. He did get Broadbent to admit, yes, the NDP will take Canada out of NATO.
All right, Don, thanks very much. Okay, we've shown you two confrontations, but there was much more in the 3-hour encounter. Here's a report from Wendy Mesley.
It didn't take long for the tone to be set. In his opening statement, NDP leader Ed Broadbent zeroed in on Brian Mulroney's free trade deal.
This deal must be stopped because it takes away our right to make our own decisions about our own country in our own way.
Mulroney, reading carefully from his text, defended his government's record.
For us, the free trade agreement is central to that future. It illustrates very plainly the difference between the government and the two opposition parties.
Mr. Mulroney and Mr. Broadbent will talk to you about leadership. They mean leadership of a party. What they should be talking about is leadership of a country. Canada is more important than any single one person.
Liberal leader John Turner was more passionate. He was also the first to come out swinging against Mulroney.
I will give you an honest and ethical government. My cabinet ministers will spend their time in the cabinet room defending Canadians, not in the courtroom defending themselves.
Then Mulroney and Turner faced off over the question of patronage. The Tory leader conceded that he hadn't moved as quickly as he should have to stop it.
Have we done it perfectly? No. Have we made, and I acknowledge that, Mr. Halton. Have we picked up our socks and improved a great deal? I think any fair-minded person would acknowledge that we have. We've put in place some very fundamental reforms.
There's nothing like an approaching election to make someone come to his senses. I think for the first 3 years, particularly of your mandate, there were more appointments of friends and chums and the boys than in any period in our history.
A political party in a new situation is, I suppose, very much like a family. You run into difficulties. It is true we had some difficulties, and I had some tough moments, and I've still got the scars to prove it. But I suppose the question is, how did I respond to those challenges? I responded by passing lobbyist legislation, the registration of lobbyists, by introducing the toughest conflict of interest legislation.
He suggested that if elected, he would bring in a new party financing law to stop donations from big unions and from big business.
Nothing like putting a few ornaments, out in the store window so that you continue to play the game back in the back room of the store. And that is exactly what Mr. Mulroney has done.
If that is the case, I asked the Leader of the Opposition why, if these were so bad, why he didn't once show up at a committee hearing to oppose one of these appointments. It's unfair to all kinds of people.
I'm going to use the vehicle of national television to comment on any particular person's reputation after he or she's been appointed.
Broadbent and Turner were next, and again, the issue was their opposition to the free trade deal.
It goes to the soul of the country. It gives Americans national treatment in Canada. It sets up a subsidy negotiation that will wipe out our social programs, our regional equality programs, and go right to the sovereignty of the country. That's why I'm against the deal, and that's why it's the cause of my life.
Here in the middle of an election, you say you're deeply opposed to it, and it's the real cause of your life. But the reality is we've had 3 crucial votes in the House of Commons. You missed 2 of them.
The next round was between Broadbent and Mulroney. The NDP leader used it to charge that the trade deal would allow subsidies in the energy sector where the Americans wanted them, but rules out subsidies where Canadians want them.
They got an exemption for subsidies in energy. Why, sir, I ask you, didn't you get an exemption so we could continue to have subsidies in our own regional development programs?
What you have been doing, going around trying to scare senior Canadians, senior citizens, in saying that there is something in the free trade agreement that would justify or suggest or empower the government of Canada as a result of this free trade agreement, to affect pensions, to affect our capacity for regional development. There is nothing in that agreement in the slightest, sir. And I submit to you that you have perhaps inadvertently have been very seriously misleading Canadians, because if
Quite deliberately, I've been telling them what can happen with this deal, and I can quote business people all across the country who are saying the same thing.
With both debates over, all three leaders will be heaving a big sigh of relief. Their campaign workers will be spending the next couple of days poring over all of the tapes, looking for magic moments where they think their leader scored. And we're bound to hear a lot more of their favorite lines as we enter the second half of this campaign. Wendy Mesley, CBC News, Ottawa.
The middle hour of tonight's debate was devoted to women's issues, and that hour provided a lot of heat as well. The three leaders all trying to portray themselves as the most devoted to things like daycare and dealing with abortion. Our social affairs reporter, Karen Webb, reports on the women's debate.
During the second hour of the debate, the one reserved for women's issues, the fireworks came when the leaders squared off on the question of daycare. Broadbent wanted to know why Mulroney didn't listen to daycare advocacy groups who disliked the government child care bill when his government put it together.
Child care advocacy groups, women's groups, not New Democrats, women who are concerned about child care spaces, sir, have condemned your program as simply another handout for the rich instead of putting money into spaces that were needed. It's not my...
Mulroney replied that he didn't have to. He listened to the 6 women he had in his cabinet because they had dealt with the problem. He cited both Flora MacDonald and Barbara McDougall, although neither has any children.
Well, why should I listen to an advocacy group necessarily, although I do?
Because they have care and expertise in the area.
Outstanding women, expertise in the area. What about Barbara McDougall and Flora MacDonald and Pat Carney?
What about them? If they supported this program, then I'm ashamed of the fact. They should have condemned the program.
You're ashamed of
Canada's children. There's
some of the most outstanding women
we're talking about child care.
And there were questions about other 1984 campaign promises. Homemakers' pensions, which Mulroney also didn't deliver during his 4 years of government. So Mulroney made the promise again.
We couldn't do everything overnight. When we came in and inherited a very bad fiscal situation, as you know, but it remains an important priority for us. It will be done.
Broadbent also wanted to know why Mulroney had done so little for battered women. Instead of defending the program his government brought in last June, Mulroney said he was troubled by the state of the Canadian justice system as it dealt with battered women.
I've been very troubled, quite frankly, and have discussed it in the month of May, publicly, by the state of the criminal law in regard to battered women.
But on the crucial issue of abortion, nothing changed tonight. Broadbent's position is still that there should be no abortion law, that the decision to abort should be left up to a woman and her doctor. Both Mulroney and Turner refused to say what kind of law they would pass, only that they would wait until after the election and consult their caucuses, and that there would be a free vote in the House of Commons. Karen Webb, CBC News, Ottawa.
Well, now that it's done, what counts is what voters thought about it all. Now, we can't get a real feel for that so soon after the event, but we did ask 2 undecided voters in Winnipeg to watch the debate tonight and give us their impressions. Barry Kirkhope and Pat Kingston are standing by now. Well, Pat, why don't we start with you? What did you think?
Well, I thought it was quite good, and I thought Turner was the winner of this debate.
You thought Turner was. What about you, Barry?
Well, I thought it was good entertainment, and it was a good debate. And I think Mulroney was really in a no-win position going into this debate. And on a couple of occasions, it's the first time I've seen him lose his cool like he did. I think the real debate was between Turner and Broadbent, and I think Turner came out the clear winner.
Okay, well, just quickly from both of your points. You were both undecided coming in tonight. You've made up your minds what you're going to do, or you're going to wait? Barry first?
I think I've made up my mind tonight.
What is it?
Yeah. Well, I think that Turner impressed me.
Okay, Pat?
Yeah, I feel the same as Barry. I like Turner tonight.
All right, we thank you both. We appreciate your coming in tonight.
Okay.
Now, David Holton, our chief political correspondent, he watched the debate, as only 2 other Canadians did, as one of the journalists on the panel. David, what was the electricity like inside that studio?
I tell you, Peter, it was a really fascinating evening in there. Every time the debate looked as if it was slowing down a little bit, there'd be one of these high-voltage exchanges, tremendous passion from all the other leaders. A fantastic night.
Okay, you know, there's going to be the temptation on a lot of people to try and predict the winner on the evening. I think it's awfully difficult from what I saw, and I wouldn't want you to try and get into that trap yourself. But in terms of toting up the evening, how do you look at it?
Well, it's especially difficult from watching from the ringside, Peter. You don't see how those TV images are coming across on the box. Here you just see a completely different set of dynamics under the hot lights here. But generally a couple of points. Firstly, John Turner, a little slow off the mark compared with last night. For instance, on that patronage question, he didn't jump in too fast. He got kind of out-talked by Mulrooney, but he was very fast coming back on the free trade issue, on the environment, going after Ed Broadbent on defense and other issues. Ed Broadbent, another very interesting change from last night. He just somehow didn't seem to be in the French debate. Today he was right back in there with his own lively exchanges, the exchanges, of course, that provide the sound bites for the newscast for the next couple of days. So a good performance from Turner, certainly from Broadbent, much better than last night. Brian Mulrooney, very, very interesting. The strategy was at the outset of this debate that he keep his cool, that he shouldn't get dragged into a shouting match with Turner. In fact, when the issue of patriotism and free trade came up, we saw a burning, passionate Brian Mulrooney there. A fascinating debate.
All right, David. Thanks very much.